TitleMatchNetwork.com.
Welcome to another edition of the RF Video Shoot interview series. Today you're joined by a true legend in the sport of professional wrestling, Steve Keirn. Thanks for being here today with us.
My pleasure.
Were you a wrestling fan growing up?
Absolutely. Yeah, I started at a young age. My mom tells a story about me sitting on my grandmother's lap. My grandmother was from Mississippi, and I'd sit on the lap. That was one of the only things on TV back in that time period, and said I got excited and everything, but I think it was just, a baby watching the TV. But I always enjoyed wrestling, watched it everywhere I went.
You go to house shows growing up as a kid?
No house shows.
Just lots of...
Just TV.
Okay.
Just TV. My family... my father wasn't really a wrestling fan, and so there wasn't an opportunity, and I didn't have any close friends that were wrestling fans that was drawing me to that, so I ended up in house shows.
Did you ever go to any live events? Like, what was your first experience going to a live event?
Actually, my first experience going to a live event was with Mike Graham, and I was 15 years old, and that was when I actually got introduced to it to a point where Mike's dad was the promoter, Eddie Graham, right there in Tampa, Florida, and I went to the Armory for the first time there.
Okay. So you knew at a young age you wanted to get into this business?
Yeah, at 15, I had made up my mind. I mean, it only took me about a month to be around Mike and Eddie and go to a couple shows and see the lifestyle. And then just there was something that magnetized you to Eddie Graham at that time. He was like a bigger-than-life figure.
What were your initial impressions of Eddie?
Kind of the hero type guy, the tough guy, John Wayne, Clint Eastwood, everybody all wrapped up into one, but not a movie star, a different star, a wrestling celebrity to the point where everybody knew him everywhere we went. When we'd go to eat or something like that, people were coming up to him, asking for his autograph. He basically gave you that hero type image and everything. And so it kind of like drew me to him because at that time, my dad was a prisoner of war in Vietnam. And I might have been looking for a father figure, too, at the same time. I'm not even sure.
So you were like 15 and 16. You met Mike first, and then you started hanging with Mike just as a friend?
We were schoolmates, buddies in school. We struck it off in high school together real close. And Mike was an only child in his family. And so, no brothers, no sisters. He kind of like hit it off with me. And I started hanging out with him, going to his house, working out, going out in the boat and things like that. So...
So you knew who his dad was then?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay. So at what age did you say, all right, I'm going to get into the business, and how did you go about getting trained and all of that good stuff?
17 years old. I'd graduated from high school. Not really sure what I wanted to be at that time. I contemplated wrestling, but didn't really figure I was physically capable. I wasn't a big guy. Wasn't until we got into powerlifting, myself, a guy, Dennis McCord, who later became Austin Idol, Dick Slater, and there was about 7 of us that hung around together in Tampa there and worked out at Mike's house. And his dad started showing an interest in us because we were right in that age group where we were thinking of college. None of us really wanted to go. None of us knew what we really wanted to be. But at the same time, we were all kind of like looking, what's our next step in life?
Now, did you go to high school with Hulk Hogan? Was he 2 years older than you, or is that?
He's 2 years younger than me.
Okay.
Yeah. I've known him since the 5th grade.
So you did go to high school with him?
Yeah, I went to junior high and elementary school with him.
Wow, that's crazy. So, Austin Idol, what were your first impressions of Austin when you first met him?
Well, he caught my attention because he was the first guy I saw with 20-inch arms. And I'd grown up as a kid kind of like watching Tarzan movies and Steve Reeves movies and Hercules, those kind of hero-type movies, and they were all muscular guys. And Dennis had gotten into working out pretty heavily and all of that, and he had like 20-inch arms, and he stood out, and it was one of those things that you just admired. I said, man, I wish I had 20-inch arms.
Who was instrumental in actually training you to start getting into the business? Was it Hiro Matsuda?
Hiro Matsuda had a little bit. I was kind of trained by several guys. Jack Briscoe had a lot to do with it. At that time, they didn't really have places where there were schools or training institutes. It was more that if guys would take the time away from the business and go down to the sportatorium in Tampa with us and work out with us, That was about the only opportunities we got. So it wasn't like a day-to-day routine. It wasn't like week to week. Sometimes it would go for a month or two before we get to train again. But Dory Funk spent time with me in the ring. Terry Funk spent time with me in the ring. Eddie Graham. And, it wasn't that much time. You just went right to work and you started wrestling, and you start wrestling like on the first match and wrestle maybe 20 minutes every night for 3 or 4 years. And that's where you really learned. You learned while you were in the ring.
Now, these guys, you mentioned Terry Funk, Dory Funk, the Briscoes. These guys were legends and great workers, and everybody knows their history. Now, you were pretty young starting out in the business. Do you think they saw something in you? Because obviously when a young guy, wants to get a start in the business, especially down in Florida, some of the older veterans have a reputation of taking liberties with the younger guys, taking their money and, pretty much stiffing them and seeing if they quit. Did you go through any of that, or did you?
No, I never spent any money. I didn't pay any money to learn to wrestle. I really feel like that they showed maybe a little compassion, maybe sympathy, because where my dad was at. Being a prisoner of war in Vietnam at that time was pretty interesting to them. I mean, they were all patriotic guys also. And, my dad being a prisoner of war, me being without a dad, they kind of like magnetized towards me. I was attracted to them. They were attracted to me. And I was always trying to do things to help out, like drive them places, pick them up at the airport, things like that. So friendships developed over time period.
What are some early lessons that Terry or Dory might have taught you that still stuck with you?
Watch every match. That was one of the first things I would say about both of the Funks. They taught me to watch all the matches. Don't just go out there and watch the match and look for the movement. Watch the actual wrestlers and see what they're doing that makes the audience react to them. Find out why the guy's in the main event and not on the first match. So as you progress through the night, you see the differences in the talent, the style, the charisma, the different things, the things that make up a wrestling match. And so they were the ones that really taught me, study the business. Don't just get in it. Learn it, but study it when you're in it. And the only way to really study it is sit there and watch every match every night.
Right. What about the Briscoes? What are some of the early lessons that they might have taught you then?
The Briscoes were a little bit different. The Briscoes were more stand up for yourself. Example, I wanted to go to Japan real bad when I first started as a young guy, and every offer that the Japanese people would give me, the Briscoe brothers would say, don't go yet, hold off. Wait, even if it takes a year or two for you to get more experience, wait, and don't go inexpensively the very first time you go to Japan, because then you'll set the margin for where you're going to go continuously. Hold out, be valuable. And so the Briscoes taught me a little bit more on the business side about so far as standing up for myself and being an individual.
Gotcha. Who were some of the other guys in the territory at the time?
Paul Jones was in the territory at the time. Buddy Colt, the Hollywood Blondes, that was Buddy Roberts at the time, and Jerry Brown. Dick Slater had just started a little bit before I had started. Of course, Mike Graham had started already. Joe LeDuc came through about that time that I was getting started. So quite a few guys in that area. They rotated around out of Florida quite a bit.
For you, what was harder to pick up? Was it the learning how to bump or picking up the ring psychology?
Ring psychology. It's easy to get knocked down.
Right.
But it's not really easy to figure out what audience wanted. I mean, people think of ring psychology from two aspects, from the wrestler's aspect of telling a story and from the aspect of entertainment by entertaining the audience at the same time. I was more focused on movement when I first started, so I really wasn't into psychology. I just was concentrating on getting my movement right. And as I progressed, I didn't have any facial features or anything, and I wasn't using facials. It wasn't until Johnny Valentine sat me down one night and he taught me a very valuable lesson. And he told me, he said, Steve, if you're going to learn this and you're going to react, all your emotions come through your eyes. If you feel it in your eyes and you portray it through your eyes, the rest of your face is going to follow. And so I went from being a stone face, looked like a statue wrestler, to all of a sudden I started getting the idea of expression.
Who would you consider your mentor? Would it be Eddie Graham?
I would have to say Eddie Graham would be my mentor. My idol at the time was Jack Briscoe.
Okay.
You know, Jack Briscoe was probably every boy in Florida's idol at that time. I mean, the young, handsome guy, all the women liked him. I mean, he had a great body, but he didn't really work out. I remember watching Jack in the hallway, and I used to, before I got the opportunity to be in the dressing rooms and the hallways, I always wondered, I wonder what they do to warm up. I mean, because as I started learning to wrestle, we did a lot of exercises and squats and things. And I saw Jack Briscoe, and he's smoking a cigarette. And he does one jumping jack, puts a cigarette out, and goes out and wrestles for an hour straight. And I'm going, wow. I mean, I didn't smoke and didn't want to smoke, but it was the idea. That's a warm-up there, buddy.
How soon did the boys smarten you up to the business? Was it pretty much a first-hand learning experience for you, or did they smarten you up and take you to the side?
Actually, I wasn't smartened up for 6 months. When I first started wrestling, every day I'd go down there and we'd shoot wrestle. And we start off and we do a lot of exercises, all based around squats, free squats. We'd do them to a deck of cards. You'd flip a card, and the face cards were 10, aces were 11. And you'd do the card deck, and you just Hiro Matsuda flip them over. After we'd done the exercises, we'd get in the ring and we'd just wrestle each other. And then somebody like Bob Roop, Jack Briscoe, Hiro Matsuda would get in there with us and wrestle us and put us in submission holds. It was constantly, back then we didn't have tapping out. I was giving up. I give up. I give up. I give up. I'd get to the point where I say I give up so many times, and then the hard part was coming home, because I had my mother living at home, and I'd come home with map burns on my face, on my elbows. I'd come home with a black eye, maybe something, out of character for me. And she'd go, I thought wrestling was fake. And I'd say, I thought it was too, but I don't know what's going on. And it hurt really bad, and I really wanted to quit when I was, about 3 months into it, but I was too embarrassed to quit. And Eddie had spent so much time setting these workouts up that I go, okay, I'm going to stick with it. I'm going to stick with it. All of a sudden, out of nowhere, after about a 6-month period, Eddie walks into the arena there and sits us down, and he starts talking to us about the business and said it's time. And he kind of explained the business. He kind of explained the idea of what a match is. He explained the ideas of finishes and what the programs were and angles, and started talking to us more on a wrestler level. And back then, it was we used the word kayfabe, and the word kayfabe had a meaning. It was, we were kind of a unity, almost like magicians. There was something that people knew wasn't right, but they couldn't figure it out. They couldn't put their finger on it. And Eddie kind of just turned the key that day and opened the door for me.
As far as other guys in the territory, you teamed up early on with Bob Backlund.
I did.
Yeah.
I did. Well, back then, in our wrestling industry, we knew, and especially the promoters, the bookers, and all the people combined that ran the business, they knew if you put somebody that was comfortable in with somebody that was uncomfortable in a tag team, you have the potential to turn the other guy, because he witnesses his partner going through things in the ring right in front of him, and then he's forced into scenarios. My very first tag team partner was Stan Hansen. They teamed me up with him when he first got cut from the football league. And it was shortly after that I left Tampa and went up to Pensacola and teamed up with a guy named Ricky Gibson, who was Robert Gibson's older brother. My learning experience came with Ricky Gibson. Ricky Gibson was a tremendous worker. He was working out of the Mobile territory at the time. He had been tutored by a guy named Ken Lucas and some of the older guys from that area. But working with Ricky as a partner for about a year in Pensacola, I got a real education, and I carried that forward on. So,
how long were you in the business before they started giving you a little bit of a push?
Probably about 6 years. In those days, they used to say you're green for the first 5 years. Well, in 5 years, you could have 1,500 matches. I mean, we were wrestling 7 nights a week. In the Atlanta territory, I can remember, we'd do a TV on Tuesday, then we'd wrestle Tuesday night. We'd do two TVs on Saturday, and then a live event that night. So you could wrestle 9 times a week. But it was consistent. There was no days off. I mean, every day you worked, except for you might have like Christmas Eve off or New Year's Eve off. But very rare did you have the days off. But over the course of 5-6 years, you're up in the 1,500 range matches. And And plus, moving from area to area, you got different levels of experience that you worked with. Because when you first started wrestling in those days, you'd wrestle on the bottom underneath cards, but you'd be wrestling guys that had been in the business 20 and 30 years. I remember wrestling guys, Wolfman John Smith. I mean, I said, this guy's old enough to be my grandfather. But he was a technician in the ring. He'd gotten to the point where he didn't take a whole lot of bumps anymore, but he could honestly teach you in the ring. I mean, it was like hardcore lessons because it wasn't like a education where the teacher says, okay, do this, and you're going to be tested on that. It's, okay, sell this and fight back. Or, they would try to give you, and at those times, the dressing rooms were all separated. So you didn't go meet with the guy afterwards and him tell you what you did wrong in the ring. It was the next night. He gave you a new lesson, and he tried to explain what you did wrong the last lesson, and then just keep beating you to death until you get it.
Wow. That's the way the business should be today.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, it's not.
It's not enough work. It's not enough work to make it like that.
Yeah, exactly. What are your memories of a young Jimmy Garvin in Florida?
Jimmy was a lot of fun. We hit it off together. There's just certain guys that you draw towards in the business, and a lot of times it was by carpooling. I mean, you rode with different guys on the road a lot of times, and if I was a baby face in a territory, of course, I'm going to be riding with baby faces, mostly underneath baby faces. I mean, because the main event guys would ride together, and they've been in the business longer. But Jimmy Garvin was from Tampa, and his dad was a police officer there, and it had been killed. And so I got real close to Jimmy, and family-wise, our wives hit it off. We were the same age. We had a lot of same interests, and just a great guy.
Early memories of Brian Blair, who you also teamed with.
Brian Blair he got into a little bit behind me. He was like on the Hulkster train there. They came in at about the same time. They were like 2 or 3 years behind me. And Brian was real enthusiastic. He was a really sharp guy. He was a nice guy, but he was almost over enthusiastic. He was the guy that you just couldn't help but rib. I ribbed Brian all the time. I mean, my early years, I would go bend over backwards to pull something on Brian. Simple example is going to West Palm one day. Brian doesn't have a watch on. I turned the clock in the car up an hour and a half. Brian had been sleeping in the back seat. Brian was on the first match in West Palm. So when Brian wakes up, he looks at the clock and sees like it's an hour and a half later, and we should be at the matches. He's on first. And I said, man, we're only about 15 minutes out. Maybe you ought to put your clothes on. So we pulled over, got his bag. Brian changed in the back seat. And I remember when we pulled into West Palm, there was an entrance way, like a tunnel way that you'd go into this Coliseum. And on the top, all the people stood up at the very, early watching the wrestlers as they come in. And as we parked, it's an hour and a half before the show starts. And Brian grabs his bags and he's running in the back door. And he's got his tights on and his boots and no shirt, the whole deal. I remember hearing people say, Brian, boy, you sure are ready, aren't you? And when he came in, then he realized he wasn't late.
Did you get a receipt for that down the line? Or?
Actually, yeah. And it's to this day, Brian and I still rib each other. I mean, our standard rib now is a lead box in a restaurant or someplace where you're out. It could be a cruise. It could be a gym membership. It could be anything. And I signed Brian up for everything. And, it's just little things that when people are going to call you, I'll fill out a card and put Brian's name on there. Or like a gym membership, win 2 free weeks at Gold's Gym. And I put, I'm 60-something years old. I'm fat. I'm out of shape. My name's Brian Blair. And I give him his home phone number.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
What are your memories of teaming? Well, actually, you worked the Valiants when you were with Mike Graham. What are your memories of the Valiant Brothers?
I didn't really work them, but one time in Miami at that time. And I'll tell you what it was, is back then, I saw the North and the South totally different. Bruno Sammartino came to Florida, and I watched him wrestle. And now I've been studying, like I said earlier, these matches and how guys got over and how guys manipulated their audiences or how guys worked to their audiences. And I saw a different style. I saw more of a brawler style, no wrestling. Florida was synonymous with more wrestling, not the lucha libre, but technical style wrestling, closer to shoot style wrestling. But Eddie Graham had a theory. If you start off punching and kicking, where do you go from there? Our matches averaged 20 minutes at a time at that point. We were wrestling, like I said, 7 nights a week. You were in the same city 52 times a year. So you did a rotation, and every week you went back to that same city. You went back to Miami every Wednesday night. You went back to Jacksonville, West Palm on Monday nights, and all that series. But you're 52 weeks a year considered. That's a lot of time in front of audiences.
Do you consider Eddie Graham pretty much the best finish guy in the business?
I would say, in my opinion,
Or
yes. I would say for his time. When you consider his time in the era that he was in, he was. But there were long, drawn-out finishes. It was probably the hardest thing you could memorize. I mean, and I remember going to the ring in tag matches and thinking, oh, God, I'll never remember all this. I'll never remember all this. And be standing on the corner waiting for the tag from whoever it was and go, oh, man, I just forgot the finish. And the referee walks by and I'd have to say, hey, ref, come here. How does the finish start? I mean, just give me some kind of clue to lighten this up for me. It's the only thing I had to remember. But it would be maybe 6 to 8 minutes of a finish that told a story on the end to make sure it got what he wanted.
What are your early memories of Dusty Rhodes down in Florida? Was that the first time you met Dusty? Would it be Florida? Or?
Yeah, Dusty was my first encounters with Dusty was Florida when he came in with
Excellent.
No, Dick Murdoch.
Okay.
He came in with Dick Murdoch, and they were the Outlaws. And then Dick left, and Dusty stayed, and they switched Dusty babyface, and then Dusty was off on a roll. But my early memories were studying Dusty's promos. Going in, and we had to do promos on Wednesday mornings when we filmed our TV, and after that we'd drive to Miami. So it was a long day on Wednesday, but I would sit and watch Dusty, and he would do 6 to 7 promos, and that would be for the 6 or 7 consecutive towns the next week. And Dusty wouldn't take, any time in between. Him and Gordon Soley be sitting there. They'd tell him what the town is, who he's wrestling, blah, 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 and go. And Dusty would entertain you. Dusty would say something funny. Dusty had expression. Dusty had a rhyming, rhythmatic interview that was so entertaining that it was overwhelming. It was to the point that it was very intimidating. Example, if I had to sit up and do a promo right after Dusty, I get out there and it was like, oh man, Gordon Soley, get me through this. Because it was like flat, boring, just baby face, I'm going to do the best I can to give 100%, which was just real sappy, but at the same time, that was that era. Muhammad Ali had just come into play there and started taking over the new concept of a babyface. Cocky, arrogant, but being able to back up what he said. Not just saying something and not doing it, but saying something and doing it. And that's when it started to evolve into a whole different idea for babyfaces.
You mentioned Gordon Soley as far as saving you, when you did a promo. How good was Gordon Soley? Obviously, he's probably one of the best guys in the business back in the day.
Well, I didn't have any experience with anybody else but Gordon for my first probably 5 years. In working the territories around, there wasn't another commentator that I can even think of that stayed in the business or was such an intricate part of that business that stood out in my mind. Even working the Mobile territory for the Fields back in then when I talked about working with Ricky Gibson, I couldn't even tell you who the announcer was on their television. And Gordon was doing Georgia Championship Wrestling, so when I worked the Atlanta territory after that, I was right back there with Gordon. Gordon was awesome. I mean, Gordon had the ability to pull you out when you were going down a dead-end street. And I had the tendency to ramble, being nervous, staring at a camera, trying to say something interesting, trying to sell tickets while I'm talking. And then sometimes I'd just get off on a tangent, and Gordon would just kind of just stare like a puppy at you and turn his head from side to side. And I knew I was lost. And I'm almost begging, Gordon, say something, get me out of this. But he had that magic that he'd come in and said, all right. And then kind of make something out of nothing that you just said.
Back in the day, obviously, his reputation for drinking was very famous in the business. Would he ever go on TV lit up, or you would never?
Not until
this?
Later on. Later on, I became part of the industry, whereas Mike Graham and myself and Gordon and Dusty formed a partnership and started Florida Championship Wrestling back in the 89, 88 era.
That's when Scott Hall and DDP were in there.
DDP, that's when we trained DDP. I introduced some guys like Dennis Knight, who later on became Midian, Scott Levy, course, I'm trying to think of, there was so many guys at that time. Even Big Fred Ottman came in on the scene. This was just right prior to Tugboat. And I mean, the Gordon didn't get lit up until in those times. And now I'm part of it, but I'm a part of it from the investor side of it. And I can remember Gordon, he smoked too. And so Gordon, at his microphone, he's talking over a match. And all of a sudden, I'm watching, listening on a headset, and he goes, like, and I'm going, what the hell? And so we invented a kill button for Gordon's microphone where I say, hey, Gordon, if you ever make that noise again, just hit this little button right here and at least turns your microphone off.
Right.
You know, okay, pal. All right, brother. Okay. So
early memories of Bob Orton down in Florida.
Bob Orton Jr.?
Senior. Oh, yeah.
Senior?
Yeah, no,
Junior, whichever one.
Yeah.
I got memories of both of them.
Either or.
Yeah, Bob Orton Sr. He was in the older group, pretty placid in the dressing room where he wasn't really standing out. Bob Orton Jr. was my age group, my opponent a lot of the times. I mean, we worked in two different territories, the Florida territory and the Atlanta territory together, in a combination with Bob Roop and partners like Jimmy Garvin or Bob Backlund or Mike Graham. And I spent a lot of time with them. I got the most respect for them. They actually educated me. I mean, they're the same age, but at that time, the heels called the whole match. Baby faces had a little input, but it's very little. You let the heel control the match. He controlled the tempo of the match. He controlled the heat of the match. He controlled, basically what the audience was buying. And Bobby Orton was really awesome at it.
What about Paxson?
Paxson, it was one of those guys that just kind of passed through a career right there that he was very influential at a time. He became part of a big angle that I was in down there where he was supposedly had broken my leg to keep me from going for the world title. I think Terry Funk had it at the time, and I was in line for it. And I'd actually broke my leg in West Palm on a Monday night doing a slide through on a guy named Don Jardine, who was a super destroyer. And it's the very last move of the match where I did a baseball slide through his legs. I hooked my toe in the mat cover and pulled my leg up under me, and I kind of shattered my ankle. And I wasn't sure till I go in the dressing room and I'm taking my boot off. I knew something was wrong with my ankle. And Wahoo McDaniels walks by and just looks down at my ankle and says, hey, you got a broken ankle? And I'm going, no. That's the last thing I wanted to hear. And Jimmy Garvin took me to the emergency room, ended up with a broken ankle. The next day, Eddie Graham had called me into the office and says, hey, Steve, we want to do this angle based around Paxson attacking you. He said, I'd like you to come down in Tampa to the ring like you're going to wrestle. I'm going to have Paxson attack you before the match and break your leg. I said, that's great, but how do I get down there? I mean, first of all, the walk with a broken leg that had just broke the night before, I mean, I was in tremendous amount of pain. And then the walk was 2 flights of stairs in front of the audience. You actually walked along the top of the armory, and then you started going down one flight of stairs and another flight of stairs. I just said, I can't do that. So they created another side of the angle that I was working out in the sportatorium, and he came in the sportatorium and attacked me.
Wow. Bugsy McGraw? Early memories of Bugsy?
Bugsy, yeah, that he was unique. I didn't ever want to wrestle him because I had learned a style more like Jack Briscoe of a serious style, and Bugsy McGraw would do one of the Three Stooges. And so the compromise was hard to get into. And I used to tell Eddie, I said, I can't wrestle a guy like that. I just can't wrestle a guy like that. He doesn't take this stuff serious, And it's like, Eddie goes, you got to learn to wrestle with everybody, no matter who they are. You have to work around them, not changing your style, but being able to go out there and bounce off of their style and keep it in tune. I wasn't a big fan of Bugsy's.
You don't think he was good for business?
No, I thought it was all right for business because the people liked him, but I couldn't see it as serious.
Too much
when they did it, it was a ha-ha thing. And when they did an angle in Florida, they made it a serious angle. And so people came to the matches and to the shows with an attitude, this is real. This is one of the real things that's happening. Early
memories of Killer Cox?
Yeah, Killer Cox is the guy that got me drunk. One of my first times I ever got drunk. I was married to my first wife. It was Pearl Harbor Day, December 7th. And we got into a long conversation about psychology and the business. And he kept I'd never drank anything but beer, and he had me drinking some drink called Canadian Club. By the time I was done, I went home. I left my first wife and moved in with my girlfriend and never went back home.
Wow.
So on December 7th, Pearl Harbor Day, Killer Carl Cox was big into the military, and he was a big supporter of what my dad was doing in Vietnam, and he took me under his wing a little bit. But at the same time, I mean, he was one of those guys that just was very influential, and I wasn't around him too much because he was a heel. I wasn't supposed to be around him at all. But I had a tendency to drift away from rules every once in a while.
Now, Mr. Saito was down there too, right?
Absolutely.
And Ron Bass?
Ron Bass. Ron Bass wasn't down there very much. I worked with Ron more when I went to the Memphis territory, straight off of the Atlanta TV. Jerry Jarrett had come to get me, and what had happened is they had traded Tommy Rich. Jim Barnett had traded Tommy Rich up to Jerry Jarrett, and Jerry Jarrett kind of rejected the Tommy Rich concept and was turning Tommy Rich back over. And Jim Barnett gave him a choice of two guys, and he picked me and Kevin Sullivan, and we signed with Jerry Jarrett and went to the Memphis, and that's where I ran into Ron Bass and worked more with him. Now,
was Kevin ever down in Florida when you were down there early on? I'm talking like the 70s. I know he was there in the 80s when you were there, but
Kevin Sullivan?
Yeah, was he down there?
Yeah, he was teamed up with Mike Graham.
Okay.
Yeah, and my first impression of Kevin was he was a suck ass. I mean, he was so up Mike Graham's butt about everything. And I'd grown up with Mike, and I didn't feel like I had to do that. But Kevin, it was real obvious, and it used to make me hot because I think the only reason you're Mike's partner and the only reason you're doing well is because you're kissing his ass all the way to the town and all the way home. And it really wasn't until I went to the Carolinas and worked for George Scott that I ended up all of a sudden riding just with Kevin Sullivan. And this was like 3 years later from that exposure to him in Florida. And one night driving, I just couldn't help it. I had to tell him, I said, I used to hate you. And I told him why. And Kevin smartened me up at that point and became really close to me. And the reason what he said was, he said, Steve, who's going to take care of my family but me? Who's going to feed me but me? Who's going to make sure that I can do things in my life but me? If I have to kiss somebody's ass every once in a while to get there, I'm going to do that. I'm not going to just do it for myself. I'm going to do it for my family. I'm going to do it for my kids. I'm going to do it for my wife. And I kind of got it. Kevin wasn't a big guy. So Kevin was overcoming a lot of obstacles. I mean, back then it was a big man's business and a burly man. Not bodybuilders, but just big, rugged-looking men. And Kevin was all of 5'8". I mean, good body, but just didn't stand out, So he did what he had to do.
How long did you stay around the Florida territory in the beginning? How many years were you there before you moved on to Georgia?
I was actually in the Florida territory for 9 months, and then they sent me to Guatemala for 6 weeks. And in the trip to Guatemala, when I went to Guatemala, I'd wrestle 2 days a week down there and be off the rest of the time. Then I came back to Tampa. I wrestled for another few months. They sent me to Pensacola. Then they brought me back, and at the end of that time period, I went to Atlanta for the first time. So I was probably in the business and wrestling from Florida for off and on for 1.5 years before I went up to Atlanta.
Who was booking in Atlanta? Was Ole as the booker when you were there, or no?
No, Tom Ernesto was the booker when I first went to Atlanta that first time.
Who was some other talent that was in the territory when you first got there?
Actually, Ricky Gibson was in the territory at the time. Bob Orton Jr. was in the territory at the time. Paul Jones. It was funny because a lot of the guys from Florida rotated back and through Atlanta and back to Florida and also the Carolinas. Those 3 territories seemed to trade out guys a lot. So I saw a lot of similar faces. Mr. Wrestling number 2, Johnny Walker, was your main babyface there, and Bob Armstrong at that time. And then Tony Atlas, that was when he got introduced to the wrestling business because I was part of the guys that went down there and worked out with him.
What are your early memories of Tony?
Just a young guy that he got a great break at the very beginning of his career. He didn't spend any time paying any dues. And one of the things I remember about Tony was getting too much money too quick. The first thing he did was went out and bought a gold Rolex watch and a Corvette. I mean, he didn't have any other money left to his name, but he's buying a car with a $600 car payment and a watch with about the same payment. So, a young, energetic guy, but built unbelievable.
Any good Jim Barnett stories? Everybody does the Jim Barnett impression.
I didn't really get Jim Barnett was always real nice to me, but at the same time, I wasn't a featured character at the time. I was just one of those understudy guys that nobody was really sure if they were going to make it, if he was going to stay in the business. Jim Barnett made me head of the Rat Patrol for a while. Of course, that was Arena Rat Report. Whoever had it would give it, who's doing the girls behind the scene, who's keeping the talent, who's keeping them coming. Actually, I had a boil on my Achilles tendon, and I was supposed to wrestle in the Omni. And I remember that Jim Barnett, I'd gone to the emergency room in Atlanta, and it was so painful. It was right where I bent my ankle, and couldn't seem to get any relief. I went to the emergency room, and they tried to lance it. And then I was at the TV the next morning in Atlanta, and Jim Barnett come by, and I was limping around. He'd say, "Stevie, my boy." He goes, "Stevie, my boy." He says, "You're limping." And I said, "I have a boil on my Achilles tendon." He says, "I'm going to send you to my doctor." So he had a Rolls Royce with his chauffeur. And that was pretty impressive in the 70s. So he sent me with his Rolls Royce chauffeur to his doctor. The doctor gave me a prescription, and the boil was gone in 2 days.
Wow.
So
Memories of meeting a young Roddy Piper.
Yeah, because when you meet some of the guys that from the different areas that had been featured in magazines, and the TVs weren't crossovers, so you really didn't know them. When I first met Roddy Piper, he was out of his mind. I mean,
everybody says that.
His promos were exciting. I mean, they were. Some I was entertained with. Some I just would go, "What the hell did he just say?" I mean, and I had been understudying Dusty and guys like that for so long, and listening to kind of like plain guys like Jack Briscoe. Jack Briscoe was a very subtle interview guy, right straight to the point. And I wasn't sure how to take Roddy. I mean, I didn't know if I liked it, disliked it, or just was confused over it. But I saw that, there was something in what Roddy was doing that was exciting. So
I consider one of the best promos in the business. I mean,
yeah. Well, I do too.
Yeah.
But I didn't get to see him enough.
In the 80s, yeah.
You got to remember, when we were working, we didn't overlap that many things. And then back in those days, we didn't have the opportunity to watch ourselves even on TV. We were working that night.
Right.
But we were gone. We were on the road. So your real learning tool in wrestling is being able to see yourself, because you're going to be your own worst critic. But back then, we didn't have that opportunity very often.
Did you work in Atlanta when Tommy Rich was there?
Yeah, I did. The second time I worked in Atlanta, Tommy was there. As a matter of fact, there was an angle with Ted DiBiase, and I think Ted broke his leg or something, because there was a big promo scene where myself, Steve Olsenowski, and Tommy went to visit Ted in the hospital. So, yeah, I was there not very long when he was on that run, though.
Any memories of Ted DiBiase?
Yeah, we're real close friends. Ted DiBiase was he was an awesome guy, and the reason I like riding with Ted is he was the fastest driver. He'd run
Faster than Harley?
80, and not as fast as Harley. Yeah, I was scared to ride with Harley. I wasn't scared to ride with Ted. But any of those guys that had worked out the Louisiana Territory, where they had 300 one-way trips, 300 miles on 2-lane roads, those guys were unbelievable drivers. So Ted DiBiase, when he moved to Atlanta, he moved out by the airport. And I lived in Stone Mountain. This was my third time through Atlanta. And I'd moved to a different part of town. I lived in Stone Mountain, which was kind of like on the other side, the east side of Atlanta. And so I talked Ted into moving to Stone Mountain, getting an apartment. And lo and behold, he met his wife, Mel. So in his book, you'll read, if you read in his book, he talks about how if it hadn't been for me, he would have never met his wife, Mel. And just recently, he sent me a text saying he was going to be a grandpa again. And it was just it's a text. And I got mad because I'm going, man, I deserve more than a text. So I picked up the phone and I called him, and I left him a really long answer machine. If it hadn't been for me, there wouldn't be no Mel. If it hadn't been for Mel, there wouldn't be no Ted Jr. If it hadn't been for Ted Jr., there wouldn't be no Ted. If it hadn't been for me, you wouldn't have no family at all. And you're going to just text me? I think I deserve more than a text. Let's get back. And so he did just like you did. He laughed when he was calling me. He was laughing. He goes, only you would do that.
Yeah, it's awesome. Memories of, I lost track. Baron Von Raschke.
I only was around him a short time, and that was in the Minnesota Territory. And when we first went in there, Stan and I went in there, and we were unusual for Vern at that territory because
I'm going to ask you all about Vern coming up.
Yeah, well, we were unusual for Vern in that territory because we were different. There were mostly old timers in there, and walked in the babyface dressing room, and I remember pushing the door open on the babyface dressing room, and all I saw in there was like Billy Robinson. First guy I saw, I said, "Oh God." I ribbed him a lot when he was in Florida. He wants to kill me. And then I'm looking around in the dressing room, and Bruiser Brody. And I had known Bruiser Brody when he was Frank Goodish. And I go, oh, God, he's going to want to kill me. I ribbed him, too. And I pulled the door shut. And I looked at Stan. I said, we're in trouble. He goes, why? I said, those guys are all shooters in there. I don't know that big ball-headed guy in there, but I'm sure he's a shooter, too. And I ribbed them all. And he goes, oh, man. So when we went in there, I remember I dropped on my knees in front of him. It was the first night in the dressing room, and we were going to work against the Road Warriors that night in Minneapolis. And I dropped on my knees and said, listen, if I'd done anything to offend any of you guys in the past, that was because of stupidity of youth. I said, I've grown up now. I don't do ribs anymore, and if anybody wants any hot dogs, I'll go get them, and if you want any girlfriends, you can have all Stan's. And I kind of got over it because it was funny to him, and the way I did it was in a humble way. But I wasn't a shooter, so I wanted to make it perfectly clear. Let's don't make any mistakes here. If it's a work, it's a work. If it's a shoot, I'm not in. And so Baron von Raschke, I remember him coming over to me and said, I heard a lot about you, kid. He says, I heard about you having Billy Robinson, teaching him how to scuba dive. And then all the ribs started coming out that I had done. And
were you a big ribber, obviously? Or?
Big time. That was one of my favorite things. I mean, so with that being said, they all kind of laughed it off, and it was a good thing I was in a babyface dressing room with babyfaces because I wouldn't have to work against them. So,
what are your early memories about Bruiser Brody? You just mentioned you knew him.
Bruiser Brody, well, I go back as far as when he was Frank Goodish and he came to Florida at first. And I remember working tag matches with him when Mike Graham and he was so green that we were pretty brutal on him on comebacks and on just working holds and stuff on him. And then later on, Bruiser Brody evolved, and all of a sudden, it was kind of the same effect I got from Tonga, who later became Haku. I mean, I didn't know he was going to develop in the toughest guy in the whole damn wrestling business, and I'd put armadillos in his bag, snakes in his bag, all kinds of things. So Bruiser Brody had evolved, and I had a whole new Bruiser Brody. I remember being in Salt Lake City, and it was me and Stan against Bruiser Brody, and I want to say Nick Bockwinkel. It was Nick Bockwinkel. And we were walking around the ring, and I was slapping hands with fans, and all of a sudden I thought a fan had hit me from behind with a baseball bat. And my suspenders flew off, my bow tie flew off. I turned around, and Bruiser Brody had kicked me in the back, and he was beating me to the end of my life. And I don't know if it was from the way I'd treated him when he was younger or if that was just a new character, but I saw a few Bruiser Brodys in my career.
Pretty stiff.
Oh, yeah, he was stiff.
From Georgia, you mentioned you went down to Memphis for Jerry Jarrett.
The fourth time I went into Georgia. The first time I went into Georgia, the next territory I went to was Carolinas. And that's where I worked for George Scott, and they teamed me up with Tiger Conway Jr. And I worked at the Ole and Gene Anderson in there for quite a while and got a real education. And that was when I was starting to come out of the green, and now I'm starting to develop. And they'd given me Rookie of the Year before in Atlanta. And at that time, it was just Wrestling Magazine. I want to say...
PWI?
Who?
Aftermag or?
Yeah, but it was Norman. I think his guy's name was Norman something, Keitzer or something. But he was the publisher of the magazine. And I remember being on Atlanta TV and Gordon Soley being there, and they'd given me this plaque, for Rookie of the Year. And I hadn't won a match yet. I mean, I've been working 4 or 5 years and I haven't won anything. And I went to Gordon after the show and I said, why did I get this? And he goes, what do you mean? And I go, why did I get Rookie of the Year? This is the first thing I've ever got. I mean, it was something to be really, for me, I was really proud of. I marked out for it. That was just a wooden plaque. And I'm trying to remember if he even spelled my name right, because a lot of people spell my name wrong all the time. So I'm thinking, and it actually helped me because when I went into the Carolina territory, I came in as the Rookie of the Year, and that's when they teamed me up with Tiger. And
do you think the plaque was just a tool to get yourself over? Or?
What's that?
Do you looking back, now that you know the business even more, do you consider the plaque a tool to get you over? Or?
Absolutely. Yeah, it was something to make that identified me. It wasn't a belt. It wasn't a title. I mean, it wasn't a trophy. It wasn't that. It was a plaque. And when I did the Carolina television up there, the first time I walked out there, I walked out with the plaque and holding the plaque, and they talked about, I was crowned Rookie of the Year or whatever that year before in Atlanta, and the wrestling magazine people had come and give it to me on TV and all that, and they showed a film clip. Well, that gave me some kind of thing for the audience to sink their teeth into. Wasn't like a experienced veteran kind of a deal, but it was like, hey, this kid must have something for him to give him that. So it gave me a little something to hang my hat on.
Early memories of going into Jarrett's territory down in Memphis.
Who, going?
Yeah.
It was a wake up call. I mean,
because of the paydays or for what?
Well, it was totally different. I had gone from serious wrestling with the territories I'd been in. They were all pretty much identical. The Carolinas, Georgia, Florida, they were synonymous for actually using the same characters revolving around there. Buddy Colt was revolving around there. Paul Jones at the time. Of course, the Anderson brothers, Ole and Gene. And it was a more serious type wrestling. Now I go to Tennessee, and it's almost like it's all midget matches. I mean, they're doing all the midget high spots in every match. And it's more ha-ha. And
a lot of gimmicks, too, right?
Yeah, a lot of gimmicks, a lot of funny stuff. And, like, Bill Dundee took a liking to me when I first came in there, and he kept saying, you're going to have to change. You're going to have to change. You're too serious. You're too serious. And I remember wrestling Wayne Ferris, Honky Tonk Man. And throughout the whole match, he'd always say, do I owe you money? Do I owe you money? You tried to kill me out here. Do I owe you money? And I was trying to bring my style to Tennessee instead of learning how to become a chameleon and change for the place I was at. And then all of a sudden, a wake-up call came again. And my wake-up call was, all right, if I'm not going to get over doing my style and bringing that here, then I need to take their style to another level and combine my style with their style. Do the ha-ha, but when it comes to an angle, get into the serious stuff and bring a lot of wrestling to the table.
What were your first impressions of Jerry Jarrett? And how would you compare Jerry to Eddie Graham?
Jerry Jarrett was in the NWA. And back in those days, those guys, they pretty much thought alike. And I almost felt like that every area had an Eddie Graham, a Jerry Jarrett, I mean, a Paul Bosch. I mean, all of those guys, those old timers. And I remember seeing pictures of the NWA meetings where they were all sitting around the tables or they were talking or they were making their plans and the different guys from the different areas. I mean, Jerry Jarrett, to me, wasn't as physical as Eddie Graham. He wasn't the guy that I wanted to kind of portray or be like or grow up to be, but he was real intelligent. Somebody told me a story one time, and I'm not even sure if it was true, but I bought into it, that Jerry Jarrett had invented the banana seat on a bicycle for Schwinn. He had gotten a job in the summer working at Schwinn Bicycle Company and come up with that concept of the long white banana seat, and I'm thinking, man, I had one of those. What a great idea. What a smart guy this guy is. And then seeing the way he ran his territory. I mean, he had it subdivided into different areas, almost like he was micromanaging 4 or 5 different territories because there were so many states involved. He had his mother taking care of the north side, so he had that pretty much covered in family. He had his father-in-law taking care of a certain area. He had Buddy Wayne taking care of Mississippi. I mean, so he had intricate people in different areas, and that was the same concept Eddie Graham used. Eddie Graham had the same deal. He had certain people in different areas, like in Jacksonville, he had Don Curtis. In Miami, he had the Dundees, that were boxing and wrestling promoters. I mean, he had Coach John Heath in the Sarasota area. So he took people that he trusted and he believed in and made them partners and then had them control it, control the areas. But he spread himself a little thinner. He wasn't just the man. There was more people involved.
Did you get along with Jerry Lawler?
Yeah, I got along with him fine in the beginning. I mean, as time grew and as our popularity grew and when the Fabulous Ones kind of like made their mark, I was always told going into the Tennessee territory, you'll never get over Dundee and Lawler. You'll never get over Dundee and Lawler. at the time, I really wasn't interested in getting over Dundee and Lawler. It wasn't until I was in there for a while and realized I really liked working this territory, and I felt like I wasn't competing with as many top guys as I was in Atlanta. I wasn't competing as many as in Carolinas or Florida. I was competing with more underneath guys and one or two top guys. And the two top guys, and that at that time, of course, Dundee and Lawler. And they would switch off the book. One time, Lawler would have the book for a year. Next time, Dundee would have the book for a year. They worked together to a certain degree, but there was animosity between them. And I kind of leaned toward the Bill Dundee more. I moved into Hendersonville, where Lawler lived in Memphis. I moved into Hendersonville right out of Nashville and close to Bill Dundee, so I rode with Bill Dundee a lot. So I became closer to Bill Dundee, and then the Fabulous one, when that started and broke out, the popularity started climbing. Then the egos started clashing, and pretty soon it was on.
Yeah, I'm going to ask you about that coming up. So.
It was on. We're going to compete for this territory.
Right.
King on the mountain.
I'm going to ask you about that coming up. Early memories of Bill Dundee outside the ring was.
Bill Dundee he had a little man's complex. He a little bit of a chip on his shoulder. I don't know, Australia, New Zealand, whatever it was. Didn't come to play too much, but he was always, to me, he reminded me of one of them little banty roosters, that would stick his chest out and try to act taller than he was and cocky and arrogant. And he was very charismatic. He looked like Elvis to me, but only like a miniature Elvis, like maybe a bobblehead Elvis or something. I don't know how to describe it. But everybody evolved around that whole Elvis scene because of Memphis. I mean, here's this guy, Jerry Lawler, the King. I mean, Bill Dundee wore a jumpsuit, come out with the Elvis look all the time. So, I mean, I think of a miniature Elvis when I think of Bill.
Early memories of Dutch Mantell?
I really liked Dutch. Dutch was a great guy. He was outgoing. He was funny. You kind of are drawn, at least I was, to funny people. It's like Dusty in the beginning. When I rode with Dusty and I had the opportunity to be around him and in cars with him, I mean, he kept me laughing. I still to this day tell Dusty Rhodes stories. I tell Dutch Mantell stories. Back then, we traveled a lot. I mean, there was a 5-state territory, so we're on the road a lot. And the funny things were playing with CB radios. I mean, we're communicating with truck drivers to drive faster, to get to the towns faster, to get home faster, whatever it was. But there's a bunch of rednecks on radio. And that's not what I was. I was from Florida. I was a beach guy. Dutch Mantell, I mean, I could hear Dutch on the radio. And Dutch would get on there and pretend he was with somebody or doing something or whatever it was. And I'm not even sure the scenario. But he would have 15 or 20 truck drivers wanting to kill him. And they'd be hollering, where is this guy? Let's get it, pull him over. Where are you? Meet us at the sign, and his Dutch would be on there just rambling on. Very creative, just in his interviews. Dutch, when he did interviews, he always had a really great gift of gab. And he came out as a serious guy, but could still do some of the ha-ha, but not take it to another level. He was a candidate to go to the Atlanta territory, Charlotte territory, in my opinion.
What about Austin Idol in Memphis when you were there?
He only came in and out, at the time. And Dennis had changed so much from when I had known him as a kid. I mean, being Austin Idol, of course, he had dropped his size. He was just a big, burly guy when he actually was in the airplane accident that killed Bobby Shane. That was when Dennis had just started. But he was the big Iron Mike McCord guy at the time. Then when he came in there and did Austin Idol, Dennis had gone strictly to the work side. Dennis hadn't developed the Jack Briscoe, the Dory Funk Jr., the Eddie Graham, all that kind of style wrestling. He'd gone more the Tennessee stuff. And he was a good promo guy, but I didn't really like Dennis's work. When I watched Dennis's work, it was too transparent to me. I mean, it was more like the Valiants when Handsome Jimmy had come in and do the Boy from New York City, based on how can we get in there and get out of there without killing ourselves.
Yeah, he was definitely not a bump taker.
No.
Yeah.
No. And don't pull his hair.
Yes, I've heard about that too. What about Sweet Brown Sugar?
Yeah, Sweet Brown Sugar. I was around him a little bit. I rode with him quite a bit in his early days when he first came to Florida. and he got some opportunities. But he is another guy that I always felt like he had a chip on his shoulder. He always had something to say about somebody else getting an opportunity. And in the position I've been in the last 7 years in teaching, this is one thing I try to get into people's heads and tell them, don't compare yourself to anybody. Don't get into this business and start looking at somebody saying, I'm better than them. I'm taller than them. I'm better looking than that guy. I got a better body than this guy. They should be using me, not them. And that's what I think he did. I ribbed him in Japan. I was wrestling Fujinami, and I'd gone to drop a title to Fujinami over there. And Eddie Graham came, and Carl Gotch came, and all these guys that had a little instrument in training me. And the night that I dropped the title to Fujinami, I held the Japs up for money in the dressing room. I really didn't. But I did it just to irritate Skip Young, who was Sweet Brown Sugar, because he had been knocking everything that I had done. It was the only time I'd ever been to Japan when they put me over every match, because it was build up to Sapporo to drop the title to Fujinami.
This is for New Japan, for Inoki, right?
Right.
Okay.
And so what I did is I talked to Eddie a little bit about it. I said, I want to pull this rib, and I want to make sure it's cool with you because you come all the way over here. And I told him what I want to do. I said, I'm going to tell the referee when he comes in front of Skip Young, I says, I'm not dropping the title. I ain't dropping it. And he goes, what are you going to do? And I says, I'm going to tell him I want 10 grand cash right now. Bring it in the room. Put it in my pocket. I'll go out there and then I'll hand him the belt. And he goes, it's a good one. So Eddie Graham, he got into it with me, right? So Eddie, when I came up with a lot of good ribs. I can go on and all night long on some ribs. But anyway,
at the end.
Oh, well. Anyway, so the Japanese referee got, he really worked it great. He acted upset. He acted angry. He went across, came back. He's mad now. I'm not going to do it. Going to cancel the match. I said, fine. So I handed the belt to Eddie Graham, and I said, well, you might as well go hand it to him because I ain't going to hand it to him. I'm gone. I'm going back to the United States. Anyway, the referee says, hold it, come back. Came back with a brown paper bag. In the brown paper bag, they had taken programs and cut it to shape of money. And it looked like the brown paper bag was a stack of money. So I said, well, I'm going to count this first. So then I went back in the back. I come back out and said, okay, 10 grand. We got a deal. I shook hands with the referee. It was like, that started it. Sweet Brown Sugar went to Eddie Graham at least 10 times that night. I can't believe Steve Keirn's doing this. If I ever got that opportunity, I would never do that. I'm more of a businessman. I mean, he was putting himself over, burying me. And the only place I really thought it might backfire was coming back through customs, because you had to declare a certain amount of money. And I thought he was so pissed at me that when we're going through customs, I go, where's your money? And he goes, I got it in my pocket. I said, I'm standing on mine. He goes, what? I said, yeah, I had to put $5,000 in each shoe, and it's like I barely keep my shoes on. And he goes, you got your money in your shoes? I said, yeah, I got to hide it somewhere. And I'm thinking, as soon as I go through customs, he's going to go, that guy over there has got his money in his shoes. He didn't do that, but.
Right. Anyway. Bobby Eaton, some people consider him one of the best workers in the business. What are your early memories of Bobby? Bobby
Eaton?
Yeah.
He is. I have two. And I've voiced my opinion on this several times because everybody has an opinion. I mean, there's no book written right and wrong about wrestling, but my opinion is from an experience level. This is my 42nd year, and if I was to pull out two names of the two greatest workers I know in my lifetime, in my career, number one would be Curt Hennig. Curt Hennig was, to me, the perfect wrestler. Mr. Perfect was perfect for him. I was around Curt at his younger age when he was developing. So Curt Hennig had the talk, the body, the size, the athletic ability, but Bobby Eaton was the worker. Bobby Eaton was probably one of the best workers ever to come out of the Tennessee territory, probably the best, and he's in the top two of my category. The only thing that takes Curt Hennig above Bobby Eaton in the whole total picture of the wrestler was interviews and promos. Curt could talk also, even though he had a Bobby Heenan or somebody like that with him. So,
what were your first impressions of Stan Lane? When was the first time you met Stan?
I met Stan. He was actually in a tag team with the guy, and I can't remember Brian's last name, but they were like the Hollywood Blondes, and he came to Florida, and Stan was real green. My first impression was Stan was totally lost in the ring. I remember that usually the heels lead the match, but that night they had said, well, you got one green guy, and the guy Brian, he's not too bad, so, you might want to call some things. So I started off the match, and I came with just a standard thing where I just said 1, 2. Well, that means I'm going to hit you once and then you hit me back. Not to stand, he hit me twice. I mean, when I said 1, 2, he goes, 1, 2. And I said, well, 3 then. And I walloped him. And then I could tell right away Stan wasn't from the physical side. He was a real pretty boy, but he was a funny guy. And I kind of liked him. And I didn't really get to be close to him until the Memphis territory.
How did the entire concept come up for the Fabulous Ones? Was Stan already in the territory too with you?
He was also in the territory, yeah. I had an elbow injury that we had worked an angle where Bobby Eaton and Coco Beware got my arm tied in a rope and took me out by beating it with a chair. But when I had lost mobility in my right arm where I couldn't straighten it, it was bone chips in my elbow. I had used a finishing move where I threw a flying forearm, and I had created that off of a commercial Dick Butkus used, Prestone Antifreeze commercial where it says, my job's plugging holes, and he throws a forearm. Anyway, going back to where it happened, I had elbow surgery, and coming off the elbow surgery, they were looking for a place to plug me in. They were trying to figure it out. Terry Taylor was the first candidate for one of the Fabulous Ones with Stan Lane. And Jerry Jarrett came to me and asked me how long was I going to be before I'd be ready to go again. And back then, when you got injured, you really did your best to get out of the injury because you weren't getting paid. No wrestling, no money. So I told him I was ready to go. So he threw the concept by me. And I told him I'd really like the opportunity. And it was all Jerry Jarrett's idea. And Jerry Jarrett used Jackie Fargo, a well-known guy in the territory, well-established. I mean, everybody loved Jackie Fargo, like a Dusty Rhodes of Tennessee, and had him endorse us. And that's what really put us over the edge. It wasn't the combination of Stan and I and our wrestling ability. It was being endorsed by Jackie Fargo that really made that Fabulous One thing catch fire.
Now, you guys got over super big. Wasn't the original concept for you guys coming as heels and turn on Fargo?
No. It was all babyface right off the bat. Jerry Jarrett's idea was Jackie Fargo was one of the biggest babyface legends in the territory. I mean, he had kind of mentored to Jerry Lawler and got him in his career jacked a little bit, and so Jerry Jarrett really, he never saw the Fabulous Ones turning heel. I mean, his concept was, he says, I could take a babyface team like this and just run with it until it runs out of fire. And we never really got to that point. I mean, when it came time for us to leave and go to the AWA, we walked out that night because my son was born, and Jerry Lawler and I had a confrontation, and I just said, okay, I quit, and walked out in Louisville, Kentucky. So we never diluted down to the point where, okay, better turn these guys heel.
What was the confrontation over with Jerry?
He wanted me to do a radio interview in Evansville, Indiana on an AM station. And it wasn't that I was, my ego was too big to say I couldn't do a radio station. It was the idea that I just had a son born the night before, and I'd been in Memphis and just got home 2 o'clock in the morning. My son's born. Now I'm back on the road to Louisville, and Louisville wasn't a stay over town. I was planning on coming home, and he wanted me to stay over and go. Wednesday night was Evansville. He wanted me to stay over and go on to Evansville that night and do a radio interview the next morning. And I told him I didn't want to do it. He says, well, are you guys too big to do that now? And it wasn't that. It was the idea that, I was pretty excited about having a new son.
Right. Whose idea was it for the tuxedos and the top hats?
Jerry Jarrett.
Jerry Jarrett? Were you
Absolutely.
for or against it?
I was for it. Stan was against the top hats. He hated them top hats. He kept trying to lose them. He really primped before he went out. I mean, Stan's a good-looking guy, but he took his time getting ready before he went out. And when he put that top hat on, it messed up his hair. And so when we get out there, Stan was ready to lose them top hats way back. But they hung in there for a while.
What are your memories of the vignettes in those videos? Because they're still talked about to this day.
It was a strange time. It's like somebody pointed out the other day that on the internet they had something about the 10 glamour shots. And so they said, you got to go look at it. So I go look at it. It's all me and Stan. Huh. And there are all these, weird shots of me and Stan. But It was kind of like looking at your high school when you were like 20 years out of high school and you realized you had a mullet and they were styled in, but they ain't styled anymore. And the vignettes were hot then, but they're not so hot now. It's funny, but I was really enjoying it. And I'll tell you why. It's because that was when MTV came into creation. And I was at an age where MTV was very influential to me. It was my age group that was watching MTV when it was introduced on cable. And so as we're watching songs and we're watching these vignettes, hey, why not? And it was a whole different concept opposed to going out there and beating a job guy on TV to get over every week and then going against another guy that was of your level for your house show matches. It was that we didn't have to wrestle anybody. The vignettes got us over. And even though they were sexually oriented towards women and drawing women to the matches, because of Jackie Fargo was such an instrumental part on it, it took the heat off of us from the men. The men didn't look at us like we were just two guys trying to pick up chicks at the matches. They looked at us, we're flamboyant. We're off a spin-off of the Fargos from, the 60s or the 50s or whenever they were really popular. But we are the new age Fargos, whereas we're doing, not only are we coming out to music, which had just started in the last 5 years at that point where music was introduced as entrances, but we're doing vignettes. And the vignettes were fun. But sometimes, it was a little edgy, like getting in hot tubs and stuff. I'm looking at Stan like, I wonder how this really looks.
Was Jerry Jarrett pretty much instrumental in all the vignettes?
Absolutely. Okay. Yeah, he was there directing, coming up with ideas. And he left a lot to us, too. I mean, he liked to get input from guys. And he'd say, well, what do you think? What do you think of this? What do you think of that? And it's like, we made suggestions. I'll tell you who else was instrumental was Jimmy Cornette. Jimmy Cornette was our photographer at the time. Yeah. Jimmy Cornette didn't do anything but take pictures of Steve and Stan. He took pictures of other guys, but he made his money with us. And Jimmy Cornette would be telling us, okay, turn around and show him your butt. All right, turn around and do this. Okay, how about just a towel wrapped around you? How about you standing in this? How about, this? How about that? And some of the times when you're taking the pictures, it was like a little uncomfortable. And the vignettes were a little uncomfortable at times because you're going like, yeah, I remember we had this scene where we're going to kiss this girl, right? And I'm looking at the girl, and I didn't want to kiss her to begin with, right? So I said, Stan's going to have to do this part. So it's kind of a Laurel and Hardy on the vignettes because I like doing them, but I didn't want to be in the smoochy thing, I wanted to keep my character over here as a serious guy.
How crazy was the rat scene in Memphis? Pretty crazy?
Yeah, way crazy. It's almost so crazy that if you tell stories about it or whatever, especially the younger guys, they look at you like you're some liar. That you're just making this stuff up. There's no way it was like that. But it was...
was that territory the craziest for rats?
Yes. Yeah, I would say. And I think it was because the ability to sell pictures and promote yourself. Because all the guys would, doing the pictures. I remember one of the pictures we sold the most of, Stan and I came out and we just had a towel wrapped around us and we were standing in Conway Twitty's swimming pool. I had become friends with Conway Twitty's son-in-law at a gym right there in Hendersonville. And we got to use his property of Twitty City there. And we did the pictures in front of that swimming pool. And I remember we did the picture with just a towel on, and it was like, wow, they're going a long way now with this stuff. But it was very suggestive, but you actually were covered up more than when you were in your tights.
How much money did you guys actually make selling gimmicks in Memphis, like the 8x10s?
We had some really good years. I couldn't tell you exact figures now. That's so far back in my history. But I know that the picture with the towel on, I think we cleared about $60,000 a piece just on that picture.
Wow, that's crazy.
But we hustled our pictures. It wasn't like we just threw them out there and laid them on a table. When we came, we went right straight to the picture table, and we went out, and I kissed more fat girls and ugly women and hugged people that I would never hug. But we all got into that, and that's where that whole scene, like all of the guys were competing. And then like the Rock and Roll Express came after us, and Ricky Morton, Robert Gibson, they were just a younger version of us, and they're doing the same thing. So it brought more women, and I think that's how it just snowballed. Plus, you got to remember this, that 52 times a year you're in that city. It's not like now. Like now you're in the city once a year maybe, so yeah. There wasn't the following. Back then, they not only would they follow you to the matches, they'd follow you halfway home on the interstate.
What are your memories of working the Mid-South Coliseum, the big sellouts they used to draw 9,000 in Louisville, the Mid-South Coliseum would sell out? What are your memories of those days?
Competing. That was when I was red hot into competing. I liked pretending I was Jerry Lee Lewis. I like to be able to walk in, and when Lawler had flip-flopped the main event and it wasn't us against the Road Warriors, it was him against Austin Idol, and it should have been us against the Road Warriors because that was the draw. I liked being able to walk in the dressing room like I was going to set the piano on fire and say, hey, follow that if you can. I mean, I like the competition, fighting for the main event spot, and it got pretty hot and heavy back then too.
Good, because my next question was, and we hear this all the time, was Jerry easy to work with as a booker during the 80s? Some say he was, he wouldn't let any of the other baby faces get over, as he always tried to keep himself on top. So obviously you saw that, right?
I did, but I'd already been pre-warned. I mean, that was their warning going into the Tennessee territory. You'll never get over Lawler. You'll never get over Dundee. And they would switch the book back and forth, like I said, one for a year, the other for a year, 6 months, whatever it was. But it would take the heat off of each other. They had real strong egos. They were tremendous talent. You can't take anything away from them. But at the same time, it was worth competing for. I mean, I watched Jerry Lawler work, and I saw Jerry Lawler that he was very versatile. Bill Dundee was a one-dimensional worker. He leaned more toward the midget and the ha-ha stuff. Lawler could do the serious angles and the ha-ha stuff. But Lawler had, when he fired up and he pulled a strap, the people popped. And I saw what I had to get over. And it wasn't going to be easy. And whether I ever really got over Lawler or the Fabulous Ones ever got over the Dundee Lawler thing, nobody will ever know. It'd just be an opinion. But it was probably one that pretty much anybody in that time period would say, we gave them a hell of a run for their money. I mean, when push comes to shove and audiences, you can't take away numbers. And when you look at numbers and the figures and the profits, my thing was I couldn't take away Jerry Jarrett's house. When we moved there, Jerry Jarrett lived in a small house on the lake. By the time we were done there, he lived on top of a mountain and owned the whole mountain in a mansion. And I used to say, that's the house the Fabs built up on that hill.
What are your memories of working the Moondogs in Memphis?
Two different style guys. Randy I really liked. Larry I didn't. I hated their Moondog bone gimmick because they couldn't control the bones. I took a pretty good shot with the bone from Larry, and from then on, I mean, there was a lot of stiff stuff going on in the ring. Randy, never really had that many issues with, so I always worked more with him. But when Larry'd get in there, I'd tie Larry up. I'd shoot with Larry a little bit more. And what I mean by shoot, not really actually trying to beat him or anything like that, but hold him down and then not let him do what he wanted to do to me. I'd kind of control it.
Okay. Memories of working the Assassins. Jody and his partner.
Jody was, he wasn't a bully. He was a teacher. He was an educator. But he was a big, strong man that would control the whole scene out there. The thing about working with masked guys is the facial expression was missing. So I always felt a little bit like the match was slighted because you couldn't see the reaction on the heels' faces. You couldn't see their emotions. And I'm a true believer that movement doesn't turn an audience on. It's emotions that turn an audience on. When you're wrestling, it's not being able to do the most fancy moves. You get what I call a golf clap. If you can moonsault from the top to the floor and land and not die, you get a little golf clap, and people move on. But when you emotionally move an audience where they're standing up and screaming for 10, 15 minutes straight, and you've got them, and it's because of your emotion, that's what I think is the missing in tag matches with masked guys like the Assassins.
Memories of working with Rick Rude and King Kong Bundy.
Limited, very limited. I mean, Rick Rude was really green back in that time period. King Kong Bundy was fairly green, but he was a gimmick. It was a lopsided match. It was like working with Andre the Giant and a partner. I mean, it just wasn't one of those clicking things like a Bob Orton Jr. and a Bob Brew or a Bobby Eaton and a Coco Beware. I mean, a lot of those guys blended together so well, it was like a well-oiled machine. When you've got one guy that you don't sell and the other guy that you oversell, I mean, it always made it lopsided.
You had some great matches down there with the Sheep Herders.
Yeah, Sheep Herders. Back then, it was Jonathan Boyd and Luke Williams, and so it was a different set. But I worked with all of them, Bushwhackers, Sheep Herders, and all of the guys that were in that era thing. Sheep Herders. The only thing about working with the Sheep Herders was they were a little bit slower. Their movement was slower and their reaction was slower. It seemed like to me I was waiting a lot of times for them to get to me when I was down or something like that. And then some of the reaction with the Sheep Herders, Jonathan Boyd wasn't as good as Butch Williams when he came in. I mean, Butch when he came in and became one of the Bushwhackers. I always liked Luke and Butch better than I liked Luke and Jonathan Boyd.
Coco Beware, he was on the Memphis scene.
Coco was a young guy. He had just got started. He was kind of the Kevin Sullivan that was up Jerry Lawler's butt. I mean, the same kind of a scenario that he was a big Jerry Lawler guy. I liked working with Coco. He was fast, easy to work with. He moved around great in the ring. But there was a little bit of an ego clash in there. I mean, he's climbing a ladder. We're climbing a ladder at the same time, and we're climbing a lot faster than he is.
Did Vince ever try to contact you in the early 80s about coming in?
No. George Scott did, though, from the WWE, WWF then,
right,
when it first started. And we shied away from it. The reason we did was I was leery of going to New York. I was leery of the territory only because of the trips and the cities. I was kind of a little bit of afraid of it more than anything else. Not anything business-wise. It was more the idea of mass, huge cities and driving to the towns. When I'd gotten accustomed to driving in the South, I mean, interstates, right up to an exit, to Coliseum, right down the road. Then I'm imagining huge cities with traffic and the turmoil and all of that. So it was the same thing I had. I had a little bit of an issue with Minneapolis territory also. Minneapolis territory was too much snow. I mean, I'm a Florida guy. I mean, and I like being around the water and doing water sports. I went to Minneapolis. I made the most money I made so far as wrestling with no gimmicks or pictures and stuff. But in 9 months, I told Stan I can't stand this anymore. I mean, it's like we're living in the house the whole time we're up here. Go outside for nothing.
Yeah.
You freeze to death. I mean, there's no barbecuing. There's nothing like, that I was used to growing up. And I just said, I got to go.
When you left Memphis after the fallout with Jerry, did you ever go to Jarrett and say your piece with him? Or did you leave on bad terms with the company?
I talked with Jerry Jarrett and just told him how I felt. I mean, of course, he was a businessman. And he said, well, you can never erase a black mark. I mean, you made a black mark. You didn't call me. You didn't confront me with it. You didn't give me an opportunity to open the door for you or whatever. You just walked out on a sellout crowd in Louisville. And so it was a bad move on my part, but it wasn't a bad move. It was time for change. It was getting to the boiling point right there that something was going to break, and not saying that it would end up in a fight, but something was happening whereas, we had gotten a little bit too strong. I mean, to the point where now we had power and control. We were really in power. And we could be pretty liberal, and some of the things I did in the territory so far as being on time, I was never on time. I learned from my mentors, the Briscoes, and some of those bad boys of wrestling, to show up, instead of showing up, let's say the matches start at 8 o'clock, you're in the main event. Don't show up at 7:30 when you're a half hour late. Show up at 8:30 when you're an hour late, and now they're glad to see you. And the reverse psychology with the whole thing worked great. But after they started figuring out I was doing it every night, it didn't work so good. But the idea was it wasn't that you were just late enough to just be late and the show had started. Now they were worried about you showing up at all, like you'd had an automobile accident or something like that. So the mood swing goes from they're mad at you and yell at you when you walk in the dressing room to, oh man, are you guys all right?
Scott Hall said the same thing, and I'm sure he probably learned it from you.
Probably. That's a bad thing you'd learn from me.
Vern Gagne, you went to AWA after Memphis, and what were your thoughts on Vern Gagne as a promoter? Did you think he was outdated and just didn't get the Fabulous Ones concept?
Well, I knew that right away. I mean, because Vern asked us, he just looked at us, and he'd seen they showed the vignettes, but they didn't show them there in entirety. They would show a clip of this vignette, combine it with a clip of that vignette, and they didn't make sense the way they laid them out. And I got an opportunity to see the TVs because I was watching the TVs and I was having my wife record them. And I'd come home and I go, well, they only played a little piece of the vignette. And
Will they be using the same vignette that aired in Memphis?
Yeah.
They had permission to do that from Jarrett? Okay.
Yeah, Jarrett let them have them, because if there was not... Jerry Jarrett, you go back to the genius Jerry Jarrett. Jerry Jarrett knew that I had made a mistake by, commanding the thing and leave and walking out. But he didn't ever turn away from money either.
Gotcha.
And you'll find that in a lot of promoters. I mean, they don't like the character individually. They don't like what they do individually, or they do something wrong, but they'll accept them back because it's good for business. And so Jerry Jarrett didn't shut the door on the Fabulous Ones when they went to the AWA. He supported them. He gave them the opportunity, sent the vignettes up, but he didn't give them any instructions. Like he didn't give Vern instructions. How do you create this territory, these guys around your territory up there? He just sent a little of the material to get us over. And then I think the ball got dropped a little bit in Vern's territory so far as getting us into the same level we were in the Tennessee territory, only because of Vern's creativity. He wasn't as creative as Jerry Jarrett, and the Eddie Grahams. I mean, he was more on the ego trip. And that's what I had heard. You always heard things about the territories you were going into, because you'd get inquisitive. Hey, what about this? You ever worked that territory? What do you think of this? And Vern was a real hard-nosed guy, and he was a shooter, and, he always wanted to control the territory, revolve it around him and his son, which a lot of territories did in those days. Family members were in the business, and they would promote them more and keep guys down for it. But Vern had gotten to the point where he'd stepped over. Now he stepped over the line. Age had caught up with him. Now, my childhood friend, Hulk Hogan, and he'd had him in there, and then just before we came in there, that's when Hogan had choked him out, front face locked Vern, and Vern went down and almost, went unconscious. And so all of a sudden the wind of the Vern Gagne and this being red-faced, screaming, yelling thing had all been pulled out of his sails. And then the Road Warriors came in at the same time we did. And so they were pretty stand-up-in-your-face kind of guys. And so I think that the new era had kind of like bit Vern in the butt kind of a deal, like that there was a new wave in wrestling. He just wasn't sure how to control it.
Did you get along with Greg Gagne?
So. I mean, I always made it a point not to go the opposite way and not get along with the son of the guy that owns the territory.
Right.
I mean, you know what I mean? But we were totally different, and he wasn't my favorite guy in the dressing room.
Right. Who else did you get along with in the AWA? Who else did you work besides the Road Warriors as far as tag team goes?
Mr. Saito was in there, and he was with Nick Bockwinkel a lot. They had odd tag teams up in there. They didn't have like established tag teams like the other territories did. They would just throw a guy together, like Saito and Bruiser Brody. That was the tag team for the week, right? And then, Saito and Nick Bockwinkel. Or, they would just throw guys out there randomly. The Road Warriors and the Fabulous Ones were the only established tag teams, came in as a tag team, and that's all they wrestled was tag teams. So Jumpin' Jim Brunzell and Greg Gagne had backed off quite a bit at that time, and they weren't really teaming up as much anymore, but they'd have been more the established team when we went in there.
We did an interview with Hawk and Animal, and they talked about working with you guys and some of the problems that were behind the scenes as far as dropping the belts. Did you have any, were you aware of any issues between the two teams?
Heck yeah.
Let's talk about that. What were some of the issues between the teams?
Well,
I know Animal and Hawk, they said that your size, and they didn't want to sell for you guys.
Yeah, it was always, that was their whole thing about anybody they worked with. I mean, the size, the athletic ability, whatever it was. And at the time, we were pretty good sized guys. I mean, of course, we weren't huge like they were, but they didn't understand the concept of heel babyface. They were heels that went out there and the people liked them, so they'd come back and they said, hey, they love us. They didn't understand that, well, you're not doing your job right, and it's like somebody like me tell them, I'd say, hey, what about if we made a little bit of a comeback at the beginning and you guys went out there and hugged each other? That'll take a little your fan following away. You guys start acting gay.
Right.
You know what I mean? And they looked at, oh, that ain't going to happen. And then the first issue we had was in Minneapolis, and the story's been told several ways, and it's because there's always this different side to a story. But my side to the story is Stan and I were just a team going in there after quitting the Memphis territory. We were on fire. We already knew the Road Warriors on fire. We'd already worked with them in Memphis and everything. They brought them from Atlanta.
And no problems down in Memphis at all, right?
No.
Okay.
Zero. And so, but it was only like 1 or 2 matches. And then now it's going to be a program, and we have separate dressing rooms. There's no time to discuss matches. The first match we were supposed to go over, and we were going to use a simple finish where Stan and I were pretty identical looking, and we'd do switches, but from unique things, like a double down, and I'd pull Stan to the floor and roll in like I was out. They'd make a tag, come in, some simple movement would catch him with a quick fall. Well, that's what it's supposed to be, and that's what we were told going to the ring. We get in the ring, and I remember Stan and I, every place we went at the time, got booed. I mean, we're going against the Road Warriors. They're coming out of the heel dressing room. They're cheering the Road Warriors, and they're booing us. I mean, this here and Chicago, especially Minneapolis and Chicago, where all their friends were. Well, when we came out of the dressing room, it's going to be like really hard to be a babyface when the audience is not accepting you, and the Road Warriors don't want to sell because they're in front of all their buddies. So it got down to the point where the match started off, and Hawk walked in the middle of the ring. Hawk was a little bit more of the aggressor from the Road Warriors. He was a guy who was a little bit kind of like hard to deal with. Animal was pretty smooth and easy to deal with. But Hawk goes in the middle of the ring and he looks at me and he goes, "We're not doing what Vern Gagne said. He can kiss our ass. We're not doing a job." And I'm hard of hearing. And I thought that's what I heard. But I'd never heard that in my career. And I'm 15 years into the wrestling business at this point. So I make the mistake of going, "What?" Like I was bowing up to Hawk. Well, Hawk thought I was questioning what he was going to do to the point where I wasn't going to do what he was going to do. So Hawk double-handed pushes me in the chest so hard, I flew off of my feet into the ropes. And as I came back, I tripped and fell. When I tripped and fell, I double leg dive Hawk. Oh, the shit was on then. I mean, because Hawk thought we were shooting. And I wasn't. I just fallen. But I picked up his legs on the way down. And then we got into it. And he just started pummeling me, in the ring. And so I just started selling. So I go, okay, well, let's see where this goes. The whole time in my mind, I'm formulating, how do we get out of this? First night in the territory, the guy that owns the territory gave us our finish. Now that we're not going to do the finish he told us to do, I got to come up with something quick here. I think that my education from the Eddie Grahams to the Ole Andersons to all of the Dusty Rhodes to the Jack Briscoes, all of them came into play in that one moment and that night and said, you're smarter than those guys. Outsmart them. And so I finally, when I tagged Stan, I remember as I tagged him, Hawk and Animal at that time, they had a limited movement. They had clothesline, press slam, a few other moves, but they're all power moves. And I had spent enough time over Hawk's head that night to get a pilot's license, because every time he picked me up, he's looking at people, and I'm getting press slam. I remember getting press slam, and I got slammed so hard that as I hit, I bounced right up to my feet, and I'm going, wow, tag Stan. And when Stan came in for the comeback, Hawk grounded him right away. No comeback at all. Just started pummeling. Boom, 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 boom. I said, I've had it. I rolled out. I grabbed a chair, rolled back in, and I whacked Hawk in the back with the chair. Immediately got DQ'd. I hit Hawk. I kept hitting Hawk, and Animal started coming in. I'm shooting with the chair, hitting him. Paul Ellering's yelling at Hawk, "Get out of the ring, get out of the ring." Hawk's wanting to take that chair away from me. I know if Hawk gets this chair, I'm dead man. So I wasn't letting go of the chair. And I was unloading on that chair. But I got such a pop from Minneapolis that I don't know what it was the audience saw. Maybe it was that we had a set of balls on us or whatever to go against these guys and then finally just attack them with a chair. But we got over like $1 million, except for with the Road Warriors. We had a battle royal that same night. And I remember I walked back into the dressing room, and it's the very same night that I dropped down on my knees and told these guys, hey, if you need hot dogs, whatever. I'd already gotten over with the babyface side, who were all shooters. I mean, real shooters, Brad Ryangens and all these guys. Walked back in there, and I got a standing ovation from the babyface side. They're all standing up clapping. And I'm kind of like a little nervous because I know I just like changed everything and I just pissed off two really big bad guys. But at the same time, I was angry too. And when I walked in, Vern gets right up on me, and he's going, "What is that?" He's screaming and yelling, and I go, "Hold it." I said, "This is the opening line on this match. We're not going to do what Vern Gagne said. He can kiss our ass." So I had no idea what to do, and that's what it ended up. Now Vern goes to the other side, gets into it with the Road Warriors, and I guess they told him off because he come back humble of pie. But at that point, I wasn't going back to the Battle Royal. I told Vern, I said, I'm not going back out there. I said, I'm in fear for my life. I said, I'm not that tough. I said, if I go out there, one of them's going to punch me out. One of them's going to try to hurt me. I said, they're mad at me right now. But if I go out there, one of them's going to try to hurt me. And I'm pretty sure it's going to be Hawk. Out of nowhere, Larry the Axe Hennig stepped up. Come over to me, put his arm on my shoulder, said, "Don't worry, kid, you're going to be fine." And then Von Raschke walked over, said, "We'll take care of you guys." And then all the baby faces kind of got up on us, and telling us, says, "You know what? These guys needed a dose like that, and they got something. They bit off more than they could chew tonight because you guys are outsmarted them. But they ain't nobody going to hurt you in that battle royal." And it was really weird. It was like you're going with your daddy to the battle royal, or your big brother or whatever. And I remember me and Stan, and I was like really deep in all of those guys. I wasn't going to get any room for anybody to get to me. And as I was getting there, I could see Hawk, and his whole head was red. I mean, he just fumed and wanted to get his hands on me. And when we got into the battle royal, as we all piled into the battle royal, all of a sudden I look at Brad Rygans has got Hawk down, and he's riding him. And then Larry the Axe Hennig took Joe down, and he's riding him. And it was like this movie that I saw when I was a kid called The Wanderers. And it was going, the guy kept saying, "Leave the kid alone." The guys were saying, "Leave the Fabs alone. Leave the Fabs alone." And I'm going, I don't know if this is going to be good for us, Dan, or bad for us. If these guys ain't here every night, we're in trouble. But it ended up being good for us because the Road Warriors got it. They got it that the businessmen of our industry witnessed what happened and took our side. So were they right or wrong? They were wrong because they didn't do it in a business manner. So
great story. No problems working the LD, I guess the rest of the circuit or anything like that?
Not until we got to Puerto Rico one time, and then we had another incident, and it was the same kind of scenario. We were working an angle with the sheep herders. They were the bookers down there in Puerto Rico at the time, and we were in a big house, and I'm sure it wasn't sold out, but it was a baseball field, but it's huge numbers and stuff in Puerto Rico, and it was so late. We're in the next to the last match, I'm pretty sure, or the last match, because it was almost 12 o'clock at night. And they kept sending finishes over and back and forth and back and forth. And the sheep herders wanted to do an angle where we slipped over because we were supposed to come back against the sheep herders later on the next month. And the Road Warriors weren't coming back. And the Road Warriors didn't want to do a job for anybody. I get it, but at the same time, this is a business, and in business, you have to understand there's a way to keep an audience coming, and there's a way to drop the ball on your audience storyline. And their storyline wanted to be the angle switch from the Fabulous Ones and the Road Warriors, who weren't working the territory, either one of them, to the Fabulous Ones against the sheep herders that were down there all the time. So the finish finally came across, and this was the finish. The finish was simple. The Road Warriors wanted to do this. They wanted to get the heat on Stan. Stan gives me a hot tag. I come in and make a comeback. Both of them take bumps. They're down. Sheep herders come down to the ring. There's no physicality. Stan drops off on the apron onto the ground out there in the baseball field, squares off with the sheep herders. I come to the ropes to see what's going on. The sheep herders, I turn back around, double clothesline, Road Warriors, 1, 2, 3. So we've gone back and forth with finishes, and I finally says, "Hey, that's a great one." And I told Stan, "Pack your bag." And he goes, "What?" I said, "Pack your bag." And he goes, "What do you mean?" I said, "We're not coming back in the dressing room." And he goes, "Why?" I said, "Because I'm going to double-cross the Road Warriors again." And he goes, great. So we packed our bags and we put them by the back door. Same thing. Come back, both Road Warriors down. Here come the sheep herders. They come down the ring. Stan drops off on the grass. Everything's going smooth. I dive through the ropes onto the sheep herders, attack them into the thing, fight all the way through the audience. They're both going, no, mate, no, mate. And I'm going, yeah, mate, yeah, mate. We fight them all the way through the audience, up both sides, old Memphis style moondog thing, just wild, way before Extreme Wrestling. But Extreme Wrestling in Puerto Rico, the Road Warriors are in the ring and they're getting their hand raised on a count out. And I remember looking back at Hawk, and you could tell when Hawk was mad because his head was red. And his head was really red right now. And we really got over stronger than if we'd have beat him and tried to do an angle or whatever. But he beat on my door that night, wanted to kill me in my hotel room. He was pounding on it. I told him, go away. I called security. I quit. I was supposed to work for Carlos, Stan, and I for 2 more nights. And I quit. We got on a plane that next morning and went back to the United States. And I waited for Hawk to cool down for a couple of months. And then I saw him again. And he always laughed about it later, but he didn't laugh about it the night it happened. You know what I mean? So he'd say, you're pretty smart. He says, you're not tough, but you're pretty smart.
From AWA, where did you go after you left that territory?
Went back to Tennessee.
Okay.
Yeah, we went back to the Memphis territory. And now we've kind of evolved away because we were proven. We not only could do it in Memphis, we did it in the AWA. We did good numbers in the AWA. We were very exciting for them. We were a breath of fresh air for that area. I mean, not the greatest wrestlers ever went through there, not the greatest tag team maybe or whatever, because they'd had some phenomenal ones, but it was something different and unique that came through all of a sudden with the MTV, the videos. And it's like the first time I remember going to the ring, the Fabulous Ones started off with long tights with a lightning bolt on the side, sequin tuxedos, and a top hat. The first night we went to the ring in the AWA, we had no top hat. We had Japanese headbands on with the big round orange symbol in the middle of our forehead. We had suspenders on. We had bow ties on. We had chaps on. And I'm looking at Stan and I'm going, I wonder what the hell we are now. I mean, it wasn't that cookie cutter Fabulous One gimmick of the tuxedo kind of Chippendale dancer. I mean, the bow ties were still there, but we'd gotten away from the coats and gone to suspenders and chaps and just different look.
Who are some of the teams you worked with this time around?
Going back in?
Going back in.
Going back in, it was back to the same thing. I mean, Tommy Rogers, not Tommy Rogers, but
Bobby Fulton?
Tommy Rich and Eddie Gilbert had taken over our place, and they had called them the New Fabs, and their interviews were like Kentucky Fried Chicken, original recipe, extra crispy. And it didn't get over. It kind of bombed on Jerry Jarrett trying to recreate something that was that, successful. And then when we came back in, we didn't work against them. Actually, Tommy Rich quit and went back to Atlanta at the time, and Eddie Gilbert went on his own, his hot stuff Eddie Gilbert. And we went back to working with the sheep herders and back to anybody in Moondogs. There was a couple of teams in there, some mask guys, Danny Davis and Ken Wayne, the Nightmares. And so there's several different teams.
Okay. What are your early memories of Eddie Gilbert?
Just a young guy. His dad was a wrestler, second generation, so he had the experience of being around the business. I wasn't real impressed with Eddie when I first met him. He was kind of quiet and shy and stayed to himself. But then I liked his work. He hadn't established himself as going over the edge yet. He was still in that green stage where he wouldn't make those unpredictable steps in the ring that made you stand out, that he's comfortable. When you get to a certain level, you get a comfort level in there that you go out there and you take a simple move or something like a tackle and you rotate it into where you're standing, shuffling your feet or doing something different off of it. It's you take just something average and you make it look prettier, or you make it look more intense, or you make it look. And Eddie Gilbert was starting to get that aspect. He was starting to get that cookie cutter edge of stepping overboard, stepping out of the box, being something a little bit more edgy than he had been before, just plain Eddie Gilbert.
When did you realize that Stan Lane was going to go work for Crockett?
In Florida, when I decided that it was Florida territory was struggling. The territories were all hanging on by their fingernails at the
This was
time.
86 maybe?
Yeah, and this is when the WWF was really taking off, and they were doing awesome. And I mean, territories like the Crockett's owned the Florida territory at that time, but they didn't put much effort into it. And I don't know who sold what percentage of their partnerships or whatever, but Matsuda was no longer involved. Duke Kiyomoko was no longer involved. And they were running smaller towns and smaller venues. And the next step was moving back out of Florida again. And I've been gone out of Florida for the Minnesota and for the Tennessee for 6 years and the Atlantas. And I had 2 kids. I had 2 babies at the time. I had a young daughter and a young son there. We're getting close to starting school. And I remember telling Stan that, I'm thinking about just walking away from the business. And the reason is I was getting burnt out a little bit. I think my burnout was I was starting to feel some of the damage to my body. And I didn't want to drag my family around the country anymore. I'm from a military family. When I was a little kid, we moved every 2 years, my dad being in the Air Force. I was always a brand new kid in school. And what I didn't want to do to my children is make them the brand new kid in school every couple of years when I had to move from one territory to the other. So I told Stan, I said, you know what, I'm settling down here in Tampa. I'm just going to stay here and work the territory. And that's when we started it after the Crockett's left out. And me and Dusty and Gordon Soley and Mike Graham took over and established a new territory, and Stan went on.
Now, let me ask you, when Dusty went to work for Crockett as Booker and all, didn't they have a little bit of heat, Eddie and Dusty? Because
Absolutely.
Dusty took a lot of his key talent and went to Crockett, right?
Right. And Dusty had been built by Eddie, and Eddie made the mistake a lot of promoters do. He hung his hat on one guy. And you can't do that. That one guy has the potential to get sick, get injured, die in an automobile accident. It doesn't matter. But it's hard to spread anything thin. I mean, you can't just put it on like peanut butter and spread it across a piece of bread. Okay, well, if one guy goes down, I got 10 others to take his place. Dusty was so creative and so charismatic. It was hard to, you weren't going to top a Dusty Rhodes. And Eddie had built his whole territory around Dusty and mentored Dusty and taught him how to be a booker and taught him about finishes and stuff like that. And then, I don't know if it was a money opportunity. There's a lot of things that happened in our industry during my career that I don't really know the true stories. I mean, it's going to be slanted. I'm going to hear it from Dusty's side, and I'm going to hear it from Eddie's side. You know what I mean? And I didn't hear it much from Eddie, but I heard it from Mike. And Mike being Eddie's son, I'd hear Mike talking about, how Dusty screwed his dad and blah, 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 blah. And I'm thinking, well, there's another side to that story. Dusty's taking care of his family. So maybe Dusty was making the right decision for himself. So when it came down to politics and stuff like that, I pretty much kept my nose out of it because you really didn't know which way it was going to go at the end. So you didn't want to jump on somebody's bandwagon.
Right. I want to mention some other names from Florida when you went back there. There was a lot of new young talent. Barry Windham was down in Florida. Memories of young Barry Windham.
Yeah, I became a riding partner of his. Barry was a lead foot. I mean, big, tall, long legs, and he would drive fast. And I always hooked up with the guys that drove fast. I mean, when I was partners with Stan, of course, it was me and Stan everywhere all the time, driving, switching out, riding and driving, whatever. But we'd take other people with us. But Stan and I were already starting to kind of like split. He kind of like buddied up with Lex Luger. He had found a liking with Lex Luger. He was a young guy getting started in Florida at the time.
You were there when he was being brought up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I worked out with him and Ron Simmons. I was one of the guys that I didn't really contribute into their career, but I went down there and worked out with them a couple of times and give them somebody to give some ideas to and help with some concepts. That's when I started to get interested in being a teacher. I mean, I actually started teaching in the early 80s because my first student was Tracy Smothers, who I taught to wrestle.
Oh, wow. I want to go back to a couple. We'll talk about Tracy coming up. Lex Luger, did you think he had it when he first got into the business?
No, absolutely not. Yeah. I mean, the one thing that I've seen in bodybuilders to the point where they're really got great bodies, not just an average bodybuilder, is they're very rigid. They're robotish. They have no fluid motion to their body. And that takes away a lot of the drama in the ring of actual movement and actual reaction to movement. And I saw a rigid, mechanical robot, non-believable, just guy had a great body. And I'm not really impressed with his interviews either. I mean, they were just so-so. I mean, if you're going to compare them to mine, they were probably better than mine because mine wasn't even so-so. But his were just so-so, and I'm thinking, well, the only way this guy's going to get a push is by the way he looks. And, of course, that'll happen.
Ed Gattner under the same category?
What's that?
Ed Gattner under the same category?
No, Ed wasn't as robotish. Ed was a big guy and everything, but he was more fluid motion. He was hanging around Killer Carl Cox and some of those guys, and he got some input from like Bobby Duncombe and some of those, and so he was leaning more towards that style than he was kind of the immovable object style.
What are your memories of Kevin Sullivan's devil worshipping gimmick?
I wasn't around.
You were okay.
Yeah, I was in either AWA or Tennessee when Kevin and Mark Lewin and King Curtis were doing the ideal and the whole thing.
Were you there for Humperdinck at all, or no?
I was there for Humperdinck off and on. Yeah, I ribbed Humperdinck. He was afraid of snakes, and I managed to catch snakes on the way to towns in Florida. So I was there for Humperdinck and around him. But he had already started switching over into doing a lot of commentary. He had gotten away from managing teams as much.
Now, were you in the car with Roddy Piper at Alligator Alley when he pulled over and shot the alligator?
No.
No, okay. You heard about that story?
Mm-mm.
JJ
Roddy
Dillon.
Piper shot an alligator?
That's what I heard.
Okay. Back in those days, it's easy to have happened because at the roads in the state of Florida, I mean, there was no interstate going to Miami back then, so you would take the back roads. And Alligator Alley was Alligator Alley. I mean, the alligators crawl across the road in the middle of the night. It looked like a log in the middle of the road. But it was very common to see them. I mean, when Paul Orndorff first got into the business, him and I were close friends, and we'd ride together. And we got into catching armadillos. And the way you would do it is we'd just pull out, get on the road, and you see an armadillo on the side of the road, and we'd pass the armadillo, and then we'd get out with our towels for the night, and we'd hide behind our towels, and we'd try to sneak up on the armadillos, and then we'd run them down. An armadillo is not like a rabbit. It's something you could actually run down, and they're harmless. They can't bite you. They're just ugly. They look like they'd tear you apart.
Yeah. And
we'd hold them down with the towel, and then we'd put them in the trunk, and we get 4 or 5 armadillos, and then when we get to the town, we're trying to figure out whose bags we're going to put them in. And we put armadillos in somebody's bag. And I remember that was back when bags were different. Even they were just rounded off tops and just a zipper on the top. And I can remember Haku, who was a young guy and not that big and didn't know he was going to be a killer. And when I put it in his bag, as he unzipped it, just the head of the armadillo popped up. And I remember him getting up and running at the door. And I know that door said pull. And he hit it about 100 miles an hour, and just flew it and just bounced right back off. And he was trying so hard to get out of there. And at the same time he went out, the armadillo got out of the bag and went right out behind him, and he was screaming, going out into the people. It was great.
Haku was definitely one of the toughest guys in the business, right?
In my opinion, absolutely.
Why is that? Just
that's a good way. I mean, that's an excellent question. It's hard to put your finger on, but I mean, the stories, I wasn't a witness to some of the stories that I heard about him being tasered and pulling the tasers off of him. And I mean, I heard at one point he pulled out somebody's eye. The guy from Portland, Oregon, gosh, I can't think of his name. He was in Puerto Rico down there, and he got hit in the head with a shovel. He was down there.
Bobby Jaggers?
No, he was down there with Hercules Hernandez. He wasn't around the business very long, and I'm almost sure that his dad was a wrestler also. And he Haku pulled his eye out in a barroom fight. Name slipped my mind. Getting old.
Memories of Blackjack Mulligan.
Another one of those idol kind of guys and like daddy figures. I was so close to his sons, Kendall and Barry, that he had to like me because his kids liked me. And so he always, was playing around with me, and I had known he had gotten into it with Andre, and then I witnessed him in a fight with Ole Anderson in the Carolinas, and he's one of them big, tough guys you knew you didn't want to mess with, but you always wanted to be friends with.
What was the greatest locker room fight you've ever witnessed?
I would probably say the one that I saw. I didn't see that many fights, one of the ones that I witnessed that wasn't the greatest was the biggest letdown to me was Jack Briscoe and a fan. And the reason it let me down is because Jack Briscoe had stretched me every way possible in amateur wrestling movement. He could take me down no matter what I was trying to avoid. And then a fan one night, we were in Savannah, Georgia, and Jack Briscoe was the world champion. And I was standing back there beside him, and a fan walks up to the rope right there, and he says, "Hey, how do you get in this shit?" And Jack Briscoe goes, "What are you talking about?" He says, "I want to be a wrestler. How do I get in?" He goes, "You challenge a wrestler?" He goes, "Well, I'm challenging you." And I'm going, yeah, this is going to be awesome. We go back in the back, and the guy follows Jack in the back, and as Jack turns around, they just square off like two kids in a schoolyard fighting. And I seen two guys just windmilling each other, and I'm thinking, where's that fireman carry takedown? Where's it go behind? And where's all them amateur wrestling moves? I mean, this looks like what I would do. I mean, in a bar, and windmill, and the guy drops. And then Jack pounds him a couple of times, and Ole Anderson jumps in there and says, "Well, I guess you're not in the wrestling business. You didn't beat the guy." And then, I mean, but I've told that story a million times, and guys laugh because it was the way, it's like it happened. The fight between Ole Anderson and Blackjack in Carolinas was at the TV. And that was a vicious fight. That was one of the ones where Ole Anderson tried to leg dive him, and he grabbed a handful of hair, and he just pounded him. And that's really, I didn't really see the whole thing. And I'm the kind of guy that if I don't see it, I can't really tell you, and I ain't going to. I ain't going to make it up. So I knew what was going on, but I didn't want to rush to go peek around there to be up on the front row of this fight, because I knew when it broke out, that they're going to be trying to break it up, and, you don't want to see those kind of things, but when you do, they stick out in your mind.
What are your thoughts on the passing of Eddie Graham taking his life?
I was really let down. Eddie Graham, my dad was a two-time prisoner of war in Germany at age 19 and a prisoner of war in Vietnam at age 39. He's the second longest held prisoner of war in the history of the military with the two combined wars. And I was putting Eddie Graham above my dad in heroic kind of situations as a working wrestler and idolizing a man that, I thought was tough, that I thought was the man's man. And I have a thing about suicide, and I believe in my heart that everybody has a hard life to a certain degree. Life is a roller coaster. You're going to have your ups and you're going to have your downs. But when you're so weak that you take your own life, you don't consider what you do to the people that you leave behind. And I lost all the respect. Do I feel like that Eddie Graham was my hero at the beginning? I do. But when we talked about Eddie Graham earlier, I don't really get into too much of putting Eddie over, because to me, that's a very cowardly act to commit suicide. And when Mike Graham's son committed suicide, was 2 years before Mike committed suicide. And Mike told me, he says, "Well, I'm going to commit suicide too. My dad committed suicide. My son committed suicide. They have two common denominators. They had me as a son and as a dad. So it must be my fault." And I told Mike exactly how I felt about the suicide thing. And I'd never told him that as long as we'd been friends and as long as his dad had been gone, that I didn't admire his dad, or I thought his dad was a coward to commit suicide. And to leave not only his only son left to try to straighten life out, but also his grandchildren that, just idolized their grandfather. So
you weren't shocked when Mike took his life?
No, not at all. Not at all. I mean, I was shocked that it took that long, because Mike, at his son's funeral, it was more just a gathering out in the woods where his son liked to hunt. And they spread his ashes. He was cremated. They spread his ashes, and they planted an oak tree out there in the woods and put most of the ashes in the hole and planted the oak tree. And Mike told me at the funeral, he says, if I can find this tree, next time I find this tree, I'm going to commit suicide right under this tree. Wow. And his daughter's standing, not that far off, and his daughter's the one that found her brother. And I said, "Mike, what about Nicole? What about your daughter? What about your granddaughter?" I said, you guys don't see this when you're talking suicide. How about you right now? How do you feel about your son committing suicide? Don't you feel left out of his life? Don't you feel like that, there should have been something you could have done, or you guys could have talked? I said, how's people going to feel when you commit suicide? And I was pretty straightforward with Mike. I didn't like cushion any of the blows. I just told him like it was. I said, "You gonna be another coward in my life? You gonna take your life too?" I said, "Because if you are, you might as well take it, next week or so." I was the first one to his house when his son committed suicide to stay with him. On the trip over to his house, I remember I kept thinking in the back of my mind, maybe I should get the guns out of his house. Maybe I should ask his wife, are there any guns around that Mike uses or has for protection? Give them to me. Let me take them home. And then before I got all the way to his house, I'm starting to realize, well, how's that going to stop him? Tell me he can't find another gun? You know what I mean? Me taking his guns away from him like he's a little kid. That's a very sad thing. I mean, but...
What was the reasoning behind Eddie's? Was it over money?
There was a lot of different opinions on that. Eddie had gotten into some real estate deals that had gone sour. Him and another guy had built a road that where a road ended. They just continued the road through the property, and it was a state highway. Eddie was back to drinking. Eddie was alcoholic. He'd been on the wagon 14 years, and then he went back to drinking, and I was a part of watching him deteriorate and his downfall, the alcohol. Eddie was a real straight guy up until he started drinking, and when he started drinking, he was a pilot, and he flew us. And I flew in some of the most unbelievable, scary air flights I'd ever been in my life.
I've heard some of those stories.
With Eddie. And
I think Ric Flair told us one.
I could tell a million because I was on that plane almost every time with him. And he'd be so drunk flying. I mean, we'd go right by Tampa, keep on going. And I mean, it's not hard to, when the state's only 130 miles wide and you see nothing but dark, and the only thing could be is a Gulf of Mexico, you go, well, where are we going, And I mean, it was just story after story I could tell about Eddie. And then my dad being a fighter pilot, on the top, Eddie'd be drunk and say, "Hey, you're old man." I remember doing a fighter's descent into Disney World during a fireworks display at the end of the night. The fireworks are shooting off, and he goes, "This is like being in Vietnam," and he flows right into Disney World with that. I'm like, "Oh my God, we're dead."
Who was on the plane with you for that? Somebody else told us that story.
I think Mike and either Jack Briscoe. I'm not even sure. You didn't look around and start kicking names.
All right.
We flew some unusual flying in those days. I remember a plane catching on fire one time on the runway. And Dusty was at the co-pilots, and this was a bigger plane. It looked like an old Tarzan plane, but we'd take these old planes with old Air Force pilots that would fly them. And we're out on the runway warming up, and all of a sudden the engine's on fire. Dusty goes, "Engine's on fire! Engine's on fire!" And I remember not even looking back, not even making sure everybody got out. I had that door open. I was down that runway. I was probably 100 yards from that plane before I ever even turned around. And when I got all the way down there, I'm turning around, and Dusty's out in front of the engine with a fire extinguisher, putting the fire out. And the pilot's got his hand out the window going, "Come back. We're ready to go now." But I'm not getting back on that plane. And I didn't get on the plane. I got in the car and drove.
That's great, dude. All right, after Florida, you went back to Memphis just for like a little bit for USWA. I think you just went in there, a couple shots, you teamed up with Doug Gilbert. And then you got the call to come to WWE full-time. How did that come about for the idea of going in as Skinner?
Jimmy Hart. I ran into Jimmy Hart, and I hadn't wrestled in a while. And the Florida territory that we had put together down there, Dusty, myself, Eddie, Gordon Soley and Mike Graham, it kind of like was losing its momentum. The WWF was pulling guys out of there left and right. I mean, it started with Tugboat, the Nasty Boys, some of the guys, Scott Hall, some of the guys that we were developing down there and trying to get going. We were slowly losing them. And then Dusty went. And once that happened, it started kind of coming apart and unraveling. And there was no funding. I mean, none of us had a ton of money saved up to keep it going. So we were losing momentum, and the work was coming farther apart. And I ran into Jimmy Hart, and I told Jimmy Hart at a store somewhere that I saw him out, and that I really wanted to try WWF sometime. And he goes, "Wow, Hulk will get you in there. I mean, you guys grew up together and everything." So he talked to Hulk about it a little bit. So Hulk pitched at the Vince, and they gave me an opportunity to come up. I had just killed 15 alligators in the first alligator harvest in the state of Florida. It was a lottery system that the Fish and Freshwater Game Commission put up where you could fill out so many applications, and if your name got draw, you could get a license. You would get 15 tags, and you're allowed to kill 15 alligators. Well, I had everybody fill out the applications. Everybody, my mom, my sister, people. I said, first thing I say to them, you want to go alligator hunting? They go, no. I said, fill this out. Gordon Soley, fill this out. You don't want to alligator hunt, do you? Hell no. Fill it out. Gordon Soley got pulled. He gets the alligator license. Comes to me and he says, hey, you owe me $385. I said, what for? He said, I got the alligator license that you wanted. Man, Gordon Soley, of all people, right? So I was the assistant hunter is the way it worked. I could buy an assistant license straight off of Gordon's license, and Gordon wasn't going. But Gordon had to go to the Fish and Freshwater Game Commission seminars on alligator hunting. Anyway, I killed 15 alligators. I had 10 over 12 feet long. I got these 2 alligator poachers in the state of Florida that were awesome alligator hunters, and they took me hunting. And over a course of the month of September, I got all these alligators. Well, I had the skulls, the big paws off of them that I traded for the production of the meat, blah, 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 blah. So I had all these alligator parts. So when I saw WWF at the first, how am I going to fit in? I mean, I'm no longer the fabulous one. I'm more back to Steve Keirn, the single. Is that going to be enough showmanship and whatever? Probably not. The work I can do. But character-wise, everybody was a character. There was hardly anybody that was a wrestler at that time. I mean, the dressing room was with the boss man, Repo Man. I mean, everybody had a gimmick. And so I walked into Vince's office and I bring in all these alligator, put a big alligator skull on his desk and all these alligator parts and just kind of stood there like, okay, I got the alligator shit, but I'm not sure what to do with it, right? And I said, I don't know, maybe this could help out. And so Vince was kind of intrigued by it and his mind went to working right away and he told me, he says, okay, I'll tell you what, I'll give you a job. You go home. I want you to let your beard grow out real long. I want you to go from having bleach blonde hair, let your hair go natural brown. He said, just let it go scraggly. He says, give me a month or 2 of my creative department and I'll bring it back up. About a month goes by, I come back up. Now, all I'd done is stay at home, working out, thinking I'm going to be kind of like along the same line as what I've done all my career, whether it be a babyface or heel, just in that same area, right? So Vince says to me this time when I come up, he goes, Steve, did you see the movie Deliverance? I go, yeah, I saw it. He goes, I want you to be one of those guys. Well, when you've been a fabulous one just recently and all that, first thing I'm thinking is, you want me to be Burt Reynolds?
All right.
And he goes, no, I don't want you to be Burt Reynolds. I want you to be one of the 2 guys in the woods with Ned Beatty that says, hey, boy, you got a right pretty mouth, just nasty redneck. You're a poaching alligator poacher out of the Everglades. And I go, I can do that. And so I was really going through a phase where, I wasn't sure how to work the territory. And it was like when I went into Tennessee the first time, is adapting to the way the work style, the audiences and everything. But I was built really well. They did vignettes, kind of like the Fabulous One thing, but only from a heel angle and from a mystique of who's a guy in the water, who's a guy in the woods, who's a guy with a knife, who's a guy with all this stuff. But one thing that made me uncomfortable about the whole thing is when I got the character, I really liked it, but I was uncomfortable in my boots. I'd always worn wrestling boots my whole career, and that's really a real important part of your ability in the ring is being comfortable on your feet movement-wise. Now I'm in like construction boots, and I had wrestling soles put on them, but I didn't feel comfortable in my boots. But the character was so much fun. The best interviews I've ever done in my life, because now I'm imitating some redneck, and it's just the imitation of somebody else was easier to do than being myself and trying to come across as myself. So I created the black chewing stuff out of watching a lot of the Deliverance stuff in the movies and stuff like that, because I said, to get across as a really bad guy, you almost got to be gross or something people don't want to be. And so I said, well, if I let this black stuff run out of my mouth when I'm talking or when I'm wrestling, I'm going to go, look, he's nasty. He's gross. Of course, it was licorice because I couldn't really chew tobacco. I wasn't that much of a man. But that's the way the introduction started, and that's where the Skinner character came from.
What were your initial impressions of Vince McMahon?
At first, I was really intimidated by Vince and the New York scene because it dated back to my earlier career when I'd had a couple of times to go wrestle Madison Square Gardens. I was brought up from Florida on 2 occasions, and it was back to that same fear of the huge cities, the traffic, the being lost, not being able to find my way around, not knowing where to live, the whole thing. And Vince was like a center peg of that whole thing. He was like a young guy at the time that was taking over an industry, and he was stepping on toes. All of the things that I were taught had just gone out the window, and Vince was like a new breed. He was a guy that was going to industrialize wrestling into a new era of being on a competition level with Ted Turner by being on nationwide and worldwide.
As far as like Hulk Hogan goes, did he change at all since you know him forever? Did he change with success?
Not behind the scene.
Was he still one of the boys?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. He's there's no way he could go through what he did and not be a different person. But at the same time, sitting in a hotel room talking about old school and back when we were in high school or elementary school or something. Still the Terry Bollea came out. You know what I mean? But in front of the audience, in front of the public. And I really didn't hang around with him because he was like Elvis. He was a center and everybody was huddled around him. And it was hard to not feel like you were almost a mark for Hogan just being around him, like the Brian Blairs and guys like that utilize that.
Like Beefcake.
Yeah, yeah. You said that. I didn't say that.
What about Bret Hart? You got to work a little bit with Bret there in WWF?
Yeah. Yeah, Bret Hart. I enjoyed working with Bret because Bret had that same kind of schooling of wrestling. I mean, he liked to wrestle. He didn't want to just go out there and chop meat. The only thing is I didn't get in enough of a program with Bret to work with him enough to get really into his work and mine blending. It was just several matches. And in this industry, no matter how great a worker you are, it takes more than 1 or 2 matches to really get your timing down with each other and know what each other's good at and what they're not good at and how to handle it.
What are your early thoughts on The Undertaker?
Everybody was a character back then. I mean, I didn't really know Mark when he was in the Atlanta area much or anything like that. I knew he was trying to find himself in the WWF. At the same time, I'm trying to find myself as Skinner. I mean, everybody was really trying to figure out who they were and how to get over. And you had from beginning to end every night, from the first match to the last match was a main event in any regionalized territory that was around at that time. I mean, I could be on the opening card with Kerry Von Erich, who would be the main event if he was in the Texas territory, and I'd be the main event if I was in the territory I'd been in. So, I mean, there was just so much talent. Everybody was kind of like unsure of what direction the wrestling business was going, but they were enjoying it. It was a lot of fun.
Rick Martel was there?
Mm-hmm.
You were there?
Yeah, Rick Martel was there.
Scott Hall.
Kurt
Hennig again. It's like, you got to work a little bit with Tatanka. Memories of those matches.
At the very beginning, Tatanka had come and tried out, and I don't know if it was 3 times or 4 times or whatever, but had not really ever measured up. And Chief Jay Strongbow asked me to work with him in a dark match, and he asked me if I'd help him. And I sat down with him, and I kind of tried to figure out where he was at. And he wanted to know everything we were going to do and went out there. And I said, I don't have that good a memory. I said, I can't remember 15 minutes in a match and tell you what's going to happen now before we go out there. I said, just listen to me and let me take care of it. And I guess through the course of the match that we had together, he got his job. And, they contributed that. Said, well, you would have never got a job if it hadn't been for Skinner, so we're going to put you with Skinner. So I ended up being this guy that he worked with first all around, and he was so green that he would come off the ropes with that deer in the headlight look, like he doesn't have any clue where he's going or what he's doing, and he'd be really scary. And he was using like a Samoan drop at the time, and I was already starting to have back issues. The wrestling rings in the WWF in the early 90s were the hardest rings ever. It was like they were concrete. I remember the first time I took a bump, I rolled out of the ring and climbed up under the ring to see who put the ring together and how they did it, because I go, it can't be this hard. And I was starting to notice, every time he dropped me, he'd knock my lower back out. Then I couldn't walk all night long, and it'd take all day to get back right. And that was what he'd do the end of the next night. And so it was kind of, give and take. He was such a nice guy that you wanted to help him, but it wasn't the guy that I desired to work with.
Who did you desire to work with?
I desired to work with guys like Bret Hart, Shawn Michaels, guys that I'd known a long time and guys that I trusted, but guys that could do stuff on their own. You weren't leading them by the hand. They had the mind of their own. It was almost like you're on cruise control when you went out there.
You also worked Virgil, I believe it was King of the Ring.
Mm-hmm.
Were you happy with the position of your character?
I was satisfied. I was thinking that it was going to develop into more, but I really believe that it's mostly my fault. And because everybody wants to think they're the best when they go out there and they can do these certain things and, they're going to shine and they're going to be the better choice of the two when it comes down to it. But I had gotten a little bit to the point where actually Vince came to me and said to me, Steve, you're an alligator poacher out of the Everglades, but you can out-wrestle half of these guys. You have to find a fine line between being your character and being in this industry. And he was so smart about character development that I kind of got it. And as I actually went totally the opposite way of all the movement that I had made in the ring before and limited myself down to basic chopping meat and nothing really, I used a reverse DDT for the first time. I was experimenting with the movements and kind of like almost inventing movements at that time to see if I could pull something out that, would establish myself. But I really felt myself slipping. And when I feel myself slipping, what I mean by that was I wasn't really trying to perform like I'd performed as the Fabulous Ones. I wasn't in my 20s and my 30s anymore. I'd already stepped over to 40. And my body was feeling the punishment of a younger life. And the ring being hard, I think I was letting, my ability in the ring was holding me back because it was all on me. Right. It wasn't, I don't think anybody didn't give me a fair chance. I just don't think I think the character was an awesome character and you could have probably done a lot with it. But at the same time, did I really deserve it? I don't know if I really deserved it because of my work ethics.
Did you see a lot of, I guess it was Shawn Michaels, Scott Hall, and Kevin Nash. Were you there during the time period when the clique was formed?
Yeah, oh yeah.
Did you see a lot of the shenanigans by those guys?
Not so much. I mean, guys kind of kept to themselves back then. The group I traveled with I was real close with Randy Savage and Mike Rotundo. We traveled as a group together all the time, us three.
I was always told that Randy was pretty closed and then kept to himself.
Yeah. He was closed, but he wanted to open up to other people. But there was only a limited few he'd open up to. And I think what made Randy open up to me is because that it was an issue of years back when he was in the Memphis territory. Randy and Lanny and his dad, Angelo, were running against Jerry Jarrett in a small territory. And then they came and joined hands. And then Jerry Jarrett was letting them run a few more towns just to clean up their stuff. And Randy asked if they could use some of the talent. And, of course, they booked Lawler, Dundee, and they booked us and everything. We were the only two guys that made it. The Fabulous Ones were the only two guys that made it to Randy's town. And once we did that, we became part of their family.
Was that IWC?
I don't know what the initials were.
I think One Man Gang worked at the territory back
might have been. Okay. I know it's a long way to that town, and then when we got there, he goes, "Oh, I didn't think you guys would come either, and you're the only two that came." And I was in that family forever. I mean, Angelo and the whole family, the mom, Judy. I mean, I became part of the Poffo family from that day on.
From, actually still in WWF, Doink, Matt Bourne left, and then he took over doing the Doink gimmick. Did you enjoy doing that, or was it just...
Not so much. If you'd have told me in 1972 when I started in the wrestling business that I'd end up as a clown, my last guy, I told you, you're out of your mind.
Right.
I mean, but I felt the Skinner character slipping, and I felt me losing my grip on my position, that I was just getting labeled as, okay, this guy can get somebody over or whatever. I wasn't really going in forward.
Right.
And then I was watching all of my friends jump ship and go to the WCW. And there's a certain amount of politics in the wrestling business that once your friendships kind of start moving out and new people are creating friendships and things, you kind of lose your grip. So I came up with the idea, and I went to Vince before WrestleMania in Caesar's Palace, and I said, I got an idea. I said, what do you think about me? Me and Matt are the same size, and I mean, Matt's a good wrestler. I'm not as good as he is, but I could probably imitate him better than anybody in here. What about if I shaved my beard off and made another doink, and there was two of them, and I hit under the ring and all of that? And Vince he was a sharp guy, and he said, you know what? Let me think about it. And it was like 2 or 3 months before that WrestleMania. And out of nowhere, when we went to Las Vegas, I was Skinner. I wasn't even on the wrestling card or whatever. And Vince called me up and asked me to come up and talk to him for a little while. And they talked, says, remember that idea you had? And I'm trying to think, I'm going, oh man, I hope I remember the right idea. Because back then you kind of give as many ideas as you could. And he says, I like the idea about you hiding under the ring. And so he went with the whole thing. And the face painting and the whole deal, I'd gone from one extreme in my life as a fabulous one, trying to look the best I could before I went to the ring. Blow dry your hair, everything's in place, the bow tie, the whole deal, to being a homeless guy out of the Everglades. And I just rolled around on the floor before they announced me. They go, hey, Skinner, you're up. I go, okay, well, let me warm up. And I'd roll across the floor this way, roll back that way, big mouthful of licorice water, and walk out and go, man, this is awesome. No preparation, didn't have to comb my hair anymore or anything, right? Now I'm back to painting my face. It's an hour. It took me an hour to paint that Doink clown makeup on. And then clowning around in the ring, it was kind of Tennessee territory style, which I was capable of doing. But, I mean, it's funny because you relate to certain things. And in my life, I related to the way my kids were being handled in school. My son was, he was teeter-tottering around the 7th grade. My daughter was in high school already. Now they had gone from respecting my kids because I was a notorious bad guy in the WWF as Skinner. And I even did career day at my son's 3rd grade class with Macho Man on one side of the room and me on the other. And they had the fear of Skinner. Now I'm Doink. Now my kids become Doink. So it was like, Doink is pretty close to dork. And it just, it's just a psychology that I just really didn't. I mean, it's just another phase of my career, but it wasn't one of the better phases that I appreciated.
How did you end up leaving WWF?
Actually, I went down to WCW.
Did your contract expire though with Vince or?
No. It was the Doink character was Matt had gotten released. He got in some kind of trouble, and I don't remember exactly what it was, but he got released. And then I was there kind of hanging on to the ball, but they kind of diluted the character a little bit. And everybody's calling me, telling me they're getting contracts away for guaranteed money. And in my whole career, no matter what happened is if you got hurt, you were out of money because you were out of a job. And there's a good chance of you getting hurt in this industry. And it was one of those things where I said, wow, you mean if you get hurt, you still get paid? And said, yeah. So I followed the flock. I'm a sheep. Wherever the sheep go, I went with them.
You worked with Bobby Eaton again, his
Right.
Bad Attitude, and I think you guys debuted maybe around '94. I know you worked the Armstrongs. I think it was Bash at the Beach, and then you worked them again at Fall Brawl.
Yeah.
What was WCW like? Who was in charge? Was it Bischoff?
Well, WCW was probably the end to me of my life and my career in wrestling. And the reason was the dressing rooms had become
Political?
Yeah, it was like a war zone. I mean, this business, now here's a guy like me that had been in everybody's territory. I'd worked in every kind of territory, all different places, all around the world. And I know all of these guys. I know them from the NWA. I know them from the WWF. I know them from the AWA. We're all the same. We're all wrestlers. But when I walked in the dressing rooms down there in the WCW, it was almost like a civil war. It was the North against the South. It was the Flair clique against the Hogan clique. It was the WWF guys over here on this side of the dressing room, WCW guys over here on this side of the dressing room. The matches in the ring weren't as much fun because they were like weighing out, are you with those guys or with this guys? And I'm with everybody. I'm an easy guy to get along with. And so, I don't draw lines. We're doing the same thing. And so if I sat down over there with Arn Anderson and Bobby Eaton and some of those guys and be talking to them, then the Nasty Boys would tell me, what are you doing with those guys? And now if I'm over there with the Nasty Boys, then the other guys would pull me aside and say, what are you doing with those guys? You're the NWA. You're not WWF. And it's like, oh yeah, where do you think I just came from?
Right.
You know what I mean? So I was getting to the point where my body physically was telling me that you've taken some punishment, and if you're not careful, something bad's going to happen. But I had this thing in the back of my mind that I'd already preset my career, and I set it on that I promised myself I wasn't going to be an old wrestler. When I got to a certain level and to a certain age where I wasn't giving the audience 110% of what I could do out there and wasn't going out there competing with everybody on the card to have the best match, I might as well go away. And Skinner was the downfall that started it, where I wasn't competing with everybody on the card. I was just blending. I was just hanging on to my job. Then Doink was just another blend. And then going down to WCW, of course, Bobby Eaton to me is one of the greatest wrestlers of all times, and what an honor it was. But I didn't feel it. I didn't feel the magic. And I just felt like, hey, you've been saying all along you're not going to be an old wrestler, so it's time for you to start fading out and don't do this anymore. And that was when I started saying, you know what? I think I'm to a point where I need to walk away and learn another facet of the industry or get out.
So you walked away from the business, which was WCW. How long were you out sitting on the sidelines for before you went to SmackDown and worked as a road agent for WWE? I know that happened in around 2000.
4 years, probably. 4 years, I kind of flip-flopped around, doing independents. I mean, you can run for a while. I mean, I had a handful of characters. I could go in and be Doink and Skinner and Steve Keirn. I mean, I worked 3 times on a night. You know what I mean? So I could monopolize the thing. The beard was a little short because I was putting face paint on, but I mean, and now I'm going around to independents, and the independent guys are, young guys, and then wanting you to give them answers to how you do this and how you get there and all of that. And I'd already kind of saw the difference in the industry to whereas what I had grown up in, it was so fast paced that it passed right by me. And so, I just, I tried a little bit of real estate. I tried doing other things to get away and see how I would do. But everything kept bringing me back to wrestling. And I never let go of teaching. I continuously had a wrestling school in Tampa and made extra money by teaching guys on the side.
How did you get picked up as a road agent for WWE?
John Laurinaitis called me, and of all days, he called me on April 1st, which happens to be, because of me being a big ribber, one of my favorite days. Well, he was in charge of talent relations, and he says, we'd like you to come up and go to a couple TVs and consider you as a road agent. I go, yeah, right. You know what day this is, right? And he goes, no, what day is it? I said, it's April 1st. I said, this is bullshit, right? He goes, no, it's not bullshit. I said, well, you call me tomorrow, and I'll believe the story, okay? And he called me the next day. And then I went up there, and being a road agent, I had the experience. I really, I wasn't the most creative guy. I wasn't the greatest wrestler, but I had so much experience and been so many different territories and seen so much that I was good for talent because I identified the problems they had, the mistakes they made. And then plus I was focused on Vince. I mean, when you work for a guy, you want to please that guy. And that guy had taken good care of me. And when I went back and made comparisons and all the territories I ever worked, it always drew me back to the WWF. I mean, then the WWE. And the reason is because say what you want to about it. It's always taken great care of me and my family. And I always made enough money that maybe I didn't make millions and millions of dollars. Maybe they're smart enough to know if I did, I'd be gone. Maybe they said, hey, if we just pay this guy just right, he'll be here forever.
Right.
And we can use him. But it was, to me, it was the classiest organization. It was, it was constantly changing. It was something that was very innovative and creative. And did I agree with it all the time? No, I didn't. But I understood that if it was my business, probably everybody wouldn't agree with me with everything I did either.
What were your specific duties for being on the road with SmackDown as a road agent?
Talking to the talent about their matches, helping set up matches, helping talk to about psychology, helping critique their matches. I even went into settlements. I learned to do the settlements on the buildings. I would go in and check the buildings for, at intermission, finding out how many tickets were sold, how much money was spent, making sure everything was paid before we left. And then just learning to be a controller. You take on the office concept. You have to understand there's a difference between office workers, as agents, and talent. You are no longer wrestling talent. Now you're an authority figure. And if you're going to be an authority figure, you got to be at 100%. In other words, you can't be biased. And, it's like, give me an example when they had a dress code. Guys got on the plane in front of me in Tampa, Big Show, in shorts, tennis shoes, baseball cap, whatever. Hey, you're fined $500. Oh, I thought you were one of the boys.
That's my next question. Go ahead.
I'm not one of the boys. I work in the office. And it goes back to the education I got from some of the other guys earlier in life, like Kevin Sullivan. Who's going to feed you and your family but you? You want to do your job, or you want to make the boys happy? Of course, I want to be friends with everybody. But if push comes to shove, then I'm going to tell the office what needs to be told to the office, because that's my job. And that's what I do.
One of my questions was my next question. Do you think the boys looked at you as office or one of the boys?
Well, a lot of them that were younger boys looked at me as the office. They looked at me as the office because they knew I just told everybody up front. I've got a thing about lying that I don't believe in lying, because you have to rehearse lies. I'm real straightforward. Sometimes I'm so honest that it'll hurt people's feelings, but don't ask me if you don't want the truth. I have no problem with telling people the truth. It's like doing these promos and interviews and this. I can tell you the exact same story over again that I've told you in 3 hours now, because it's the truth. And if I tell the truth to the talent, the truth is I am part of the office. Don't do something in front of me that you don't want Vince McMahon to know about, because then I'm going to pick up the phone and call him. Because guess what? Let's just say I don't. And Dean Malenko's on the same flight. And Dean Malenko picks up the phone and calls and said, hey, Big Show was out of dress code and all of that. Wasn't Steve Keirn on that flight with you? I wonder why Steve Keirn didn't call us. Now I've lost my job because I wasn't doing my job.
Any of the boys ever give you any issues without naming names?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, well, you didn't used to be like this. Or didn't you do these things too when you were younger? Yeah, I did. But I wasn't getting paid to do the job I'm doing now.
Right. What are your early thoughts on John Cena when you first saw him coming up?
I was intrigued by John Cena. And I'll tell you what intrigued me. I really didn't think he was a great wrestler, and I identified it with probably his outfit. Because wrestling in high-top tennis shoes doesn't give you the same feeling. It's going back to what I said about being Skinner. I wasn't comfortable in construction boots wrestling. I was only comfortable in wrestling boots. And I thought he was a little awkward. But what I saw was a guy with an incredible work ethic. I mean, he wanted to do anything and everything and was never shy about volunteering time. And this was in his young stages. And I'd watch him go out to the ring and rap. And I would see him identifying with a new generation of people, not only wrestling fans, but educated talent that was coming in. And he was standing out. I'm not like a guy that can look into the future and look at a guy and say, wow, this guy's going to be the best. He's going to be a main event WrestleMania someday or whatever. I'm a guy that recognizes work and passion. And that's what I get off on. I get off on, if you're in my industry and you're passionate about my industry, then I'm going to bend over backwards trying to help you and give you everything I know. And you can weed it out, whether you like it or not. It can go in one ear and out the other. But a guy like John Cena, I went to him as he developed, and they asked me some things. Every once in a while, if you see something, say something. Well, I mean, John Cena was doing so well, it's pretty hard for me to go to a guy that's drawing large houses and doing great and say, hey, you're doing something wrong. You know what I mean? But I tried it one time, and he accepted it well, and my input was simple. John Cena was throwing a right-handed punch on every movement. It was always a right-handed punch, a right-handed punch, a right-handed punch, and he never threw his left. And I said, John, if you could just learn to throw your left and your right, that would make you a little bit more versatile, and it'd make you, to me, look like you're more of a natural fighter than just throwing a right hand. And I watched him change, and I don't know if I'm the only one that gave him that input. I don't know if I helped him at all, or if that was a combination of me and 10 million other people in his ears. But what I didn't get from John Cena was rejection. Like a guy, he could have looked at me and said, hey, you never made it to my level, so how can you tell me what to be? He accepted my ability and my reputation and my experience level to at least say that maybe Steve's trying to help me, which I was. I mean, all I want to do is, my goal is to see as many people become successful off of my knowledge as I can possibly help. It's not to be the wrestler anymore. It's to be a part of their life that someday, if I said, everybody in this room stand up if I taught you anything in this wrestling business, and more than 5 people stand up.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah. Randy Orton, same thing. Any good stories with Randy?
Randy, I met Randy younger. I met Randy when he was at OVW. And whenever I'd go into OVW, Randy had picked me up. And I already had a family attachment because of the Bob Orton Jr. and the Bob Orton Sr. and his dad helping me out so much. I saw the natural ability in Randy as the same as I see in Curtis Axel from Curt Hennig. I see the natural ability that their dads genetically, had, and they have acquired. I see Axel changing like I saw Randy change, and I see him developing into top talent. And he was always an awesome wrestler.
How did you wind up getting so involved down in Florida with the school that first started in Tampa?
The developmental?
That was your school.
Yeah, well, right. It was because that I was in that side of the industry. I mean, you could be an awesome wrestler, and there's tons of guys out there that if you were to say, okay, well, who would you want to teach you? I might be one of the last guys on a list of about 100. But what I learned is how to teach. And it's just like anything else. It takes time. It takes experience. It takes success and failure. And understanding that they're human beings, you have to be very descriptive. You have to be able to come up with adjectives that keep them interested in what you're talking, almost like Gordon Soley talking to talent as you're teaching them. But I was getting a little tired of the traveling as a road agent. And now I'm into my 50s. And I'm looking at it like, okay, well, you're gone all the time. You're still gone. Your kids have grown up. You've missed their life growing up. Now you're having grandchildren. You're going to miss their life. And I went to John and told him, I said, I don't know what I can do, but I'm getting tired of being a road agent because I'm getting tired of going to the airport. One of the most hated parts of Tampa is going to that airport. I just didn't want to get on the plane and go through that lonely thing of leaving my family anymore. And he goes, well, what do you think about taking over the developmental and teaching? And I said, I'd really like to do that. And I told him, I said, I don't know if you remember, but back 6 years ago when I started, I said I wanted to teach. And you told me Rocky Johnson was teaching in Florida, so that was the only school they were going to endorse because of The Rock. And I said, well, I think I can teach better than him. And he goes, John Laurinaitis said, well, maybe you can, maybe you can't. But at the same time, that's where we're at. And so when he offered me opportunity, he told me, he said, well, we're potentially going to close down OVW in Deep South and that. So I hate to be the guy that steps in when everything else is going down and now you're taking over. But they gave me an opportunity, and it was something I was qualified to do. Number one, run live events. To me, my belief is if you're going to teach, the most important tool of teaching is making sure they can get in front of a live audience. Because you could teach all day long in a gym, 365 days a year, and then you put them in front of a live audience and they fail. But if you give them the opportunity to get in front of live audiences continuously, at least they develop to whereas they get a feel for the... Is that me?
I think so.
Yeah.
Or aliens have landed.
Yeah. My wife might have texted me by that. But they get a feel for the...
You want to pause it?
Yeah, it was, but I'll text her. I'm almost done, right?
Yeah, 25 left.
Okay. So, I mean, my development into the developmental thing gave me an opportunity to be a part of a lot of people's lives and be a part of the best company going. And that was my opinion, As long as I could stay with the WWE, I wanted to teach. If I had to go to somebody else, I'm done.
What goes on down in Florida once a guy gets signed? Take us through the process that they go through. What do they learn first?
They learn to be humble and they learn respect. We start teaching them right off the bat. The whole thing about the industry is not having attitudes. It's not being personas in the dressing room that you see on television. That if you are not understanding our industry, you need to wake up and understand. I taught how to take respect and humbleness and turn it into something that you could develop friendships and relations off of. My idea is okay, if you have to put the ring together and tear it down, you're not going to have to do that when you become a big star. But when you walk in that building that night, you might walk up to somebody that just did that after you know what goes in this. Hey, man, good job on that ring. Now, that might be a little person to everybody else, but you made them feel good about their job. And that's part of the whole process. Nothing works by itself. Everything has components. And our industry has multiple components. They start off learning basic skills, chain wrestling movement. They don't start off bumping real hard at first. They just kind of ease into that. And then you, depending on the size of the classes you have, and we ranged everywhere from when I first started with about 30 talent all the way up to later on when we got 100 talent down there, that you get skill levels. And to me, if you put somebody that's pretty skillful with somebody that's not, they're going to get an education because of the way I was taught by older guys in the ring.
When a worker comes down to the school, what is the first thing that stands out that makes the WWE invest time in them?
And that's hard. Yeah, there's nothing really that I can say unless they're like 7 foot tall with 3 eyeballs. I mean, there's nothing in particular that, okay, if you got this, we're going to all just drop whatever we're doing and rush to you. It takes time to learn because starting in developmental is intimidating to no matter who it is. They come in, they're surrounded by people that are better than them. They've been there longer than them. They might have grown up in the business. They might be second, third generation wrestlers. They're surrounded by multitudes of talent. And so it's intimidating. And so you're not going to really see that real person for the first 3 to 6 months. Then they let their guard down. The one thing that's most important to us in the WWE right now, and what I was told by Vince McMahon when I first took this over, is, Steve, you can't give me the greatest wrestlers in a short time period, but what you can do is give me good people. I want good people. So if you see bad characteristics, or if you see people that have a tendency to do things that would embarrass us or reflect on our industry, either weed them out or figure out how to change them. And I thought that was pretty cool to have a boss that didn't demand great wrestlers, but just, wanted good people so there was no more troubles and no more, whatever. Whenever something bad happens, it reflects on all of us. And so we want as little of that possible to happen, and best you can control it.
At one time, I know I was talking to somebody, Tommy Dreamer was telling me that they were looking for guys only a certain size and, a certain weight. Is that the case anymore? Or obviously not, because, the Brian and...
No, and people that say things like that are narrow-minded to the point where that's what they see.
Right.
And wrestling, like I say, is an opinion. Everybody's got their opinion, and everything in wrestling is an opinion. And somebody's saying, well, they had to be certain sizes. Okay, I don't believe that. I mean, I've seen a lot of guys in all different sizes. I had Evan Bourne come through there. And if you have to be a certain size, he's not that size.
Right.
And he made it. I mean, I've had guys that have come. I had a 7 foot guy that was a bodybuilder, that was a monster, should have made millions of dollars and should have been a big star, and he didn't make it. And he had no heart, no passion for the industry.
Who are some of the other trainers down there? I know Dusty's down there. I think Norman, Joey Matthews.
Billy Gunn is down there. Terry Taylor is down there.
Kidman's still down there?
No, Kidman is a timekeeper, and he does the timekeeping on the TVs and stuff. He's a road agent. And Nick Densmore just started down there this past week. Robbie Brooks' side started, from England. So they've got great trainers.
What are the roles? Like Dusty's pretty much the promo guy, teaches guys.
Yeah, he's creative. He's creative and helps them with their promo skills and coming up with concepts and ideas and learning to have characters.
What about Joey and Norman? What do they do?
Basic skills and just different levels. I mean, Norman might have the beginner's class for a certain time period and then Joey switch off, or Joey have, it's given a variety because if not, it's going to be slanted by one guy teaching everybody. So you get a choice of things. And the girls have Sarah in there as a female trainer, which is a phenomenal idea, which should have been done years ago. But they, I think is great because women are more comfortable working with women.
How long is each guy down in the facility before they get called up to TV? Does it vary? I mean,
Yeah. It's just like anything else. Some guys develop faster than others. Some guys are naturals. Some guys struggle with it. Some guys almost go to a breaking point where they're ready to release them, and then the light comes on. There's no set time. Nobody can tell you how long it's going to take.
Once you see somebody that has talent and you think they're good to go and maybe they have the it factor, who do you call? Do you call Vince himself, or do you go through the channels? Is it Johnny Ace or whoever?
I really don't acknowledge it as much as letting them show themselves. The WWE is on top of everything. They get films from there. They got all the live events. We had a TV show going down there. They had the opportunity to look at tapes on their own. They had the opportunities to pick out the talent that's gone from, maybe they saw them 6 months ago, now they're seeing them and they see a developmental on them that these guys are on the right path. It's not like you see somebody, it's like if somebody walked through the door and had 3 eyes, I'd be on the phone.
Right.
I'd call somebody. I go, I don't know if this guy can do anything, but he's got an extra eyeball that's cool as shit.
Do you still go to TVs at all, or pretty much no? You just stay down?
No.
Okay.
I don't. I go to some of the pay-per-views when I'm asked to. Most every WrestleMania. If there's a TV in Tampa, of course, I'm going to go to it.
What guys are you most happy about producing from the facility?
I like Dolph Ziggler, Sheamus, Drew McIntyre, Wade Barrett. T.J. Wilson, Natty Neidhart, the Bella Twins. There's a montage of characters. And not one person was my ultimate favorite, because I learned a long time ago that if you concentrate on one person, it'll show favoritism, and that takes away your ability to teach everybody. But I'm really proud of everybody that's up there that I had an opportunity to have a part of their life or their career or touch. Jack Swagger. And I get the appreciation back from them. When I do go to a TV or I do show up at a live event that they're on and everything, they come to me, they thank me for their opportunity, they thank me for what I did for their career. And I tell them, this is simple. I didn't do it. You did it. I just gave you a little part of me to help out. But there was other guys in there teaching you too. Not one person can produce talent. It takes multiple other people helping.
What are the benefits of the new facility compared to the old one?
It's much more modern. It's larger. It's high tech. The talent has abilities to do promos in private rooms. They have abilities to watch film at any time. It's far advanced to what we were doing, but it's a great step forward. And the reason it is because things happen for a certain time period, and then people become complacent. They need a change. And if you go down, it's a negative change. But if you expand and you go forward, it's a positive change. A lot of people thought that I'd be upset that it moved from Tampa over to Orlando. But I don't see it that way. I see it as part of progress.
Did you have to move too?
No, I could drive back and forth. It's only 80 miles for me, and driving in this business, that's like going to 7-Eleven. So they've left me an open opportunity to go back and forth, and I still help with the Tampa building is still under a lease, so we run live events out of that. I contribute on the live events, and I'm around. I'm very political in the state of Florida, whereas building managers, sheriff's departments, things like that, I'm well known enough to where if they have an issue, they can come to me and we can talk it over and usually smooth it out without any problems.
Who are some guys that have recently been signed that you're very happy with that you think is going to make it in WWE when they get called up to TV, like an El Generico?
I think Sean Spears being re-signed again. I thought he was a talented guy. I saw a lot of talent in him. I still see some weaknesses, but it's from just, like being in a position where he couldn't wrestle as much as he needed to. The Sammys, Chris Hero, that Cassius Ohno now that we have, some of the foreign guys, Alexander Rusov that we brought over from Bulgaria. I see a lot of potential talent, but I just don't know where the room's going to come from to fit them in. You know what I mean? Because we just produced a lot of talent in the last 6 years and filled a lot of slots. And I'm on a fence post here because I had such a big part of their career that to continuously produce talent that might weed them out, I'm almost creating a scenario as where I made you and then I broke you. And I don't want to do that. So this is really a good time for me because I backed down out of the picture a little bit, whereas the whole new team has taken over, and it's a really well-oiled machine the way they're doing it now. And, it's one of those things that you can either be upset about it or be happy about it. And I'm happy about it. So I see a lot of potential in the school, especially now.
I could probably sit here for hours and ask you about all the current talent. And I don't really want to do that because you're still with the company and, I want to be politically correct. So I'm going to move on and wrap this up. I just have a couple last questions I do want to ask you. What do you miss most about the business?
The fun in the dressing room. I would say that maybe it's because you're younger and you're excited about the business. Maybe that's a part of your life. I mean, I have fans come to me all the time and go, man, I remember the good old days when this was going on, and they're fans. Well, I remember the good old days too. I wasn't making that much money. I mean, I never got rich with what I was doing. I was comfortable in my life. My wife didn't have to work, so she could be a stay-home mom. So I couldn't ask much more than that out of a job. But I missed the fun. The fun was, a bunch of young guys hanging out together, and we rode to the towns. And so you created relationships and friendships that it's like Randy Macho Man Savage used to say, it's an unconditional friendship in our industry. It's like me today. I can walk out of that restaurant, walk right up there and see Roddy Piper. And it's not like I haven't seen him probably in a year. Maybe the last time I saw him was at WrestleMania or whatever. But there's still that same relationship, that same friendship, and, camaraderie. And then there's the flashbacks of some of the funny things that happened in your life together, or some things that make you smile when you see each other. I miss that.
What do you think about the revival of tag team wrestling in the WWE? Because, it's no secret that Vince really doesn't see money in tag teams, or he changed his vision on that, or I don't know if it's Hunter. Being that you were a top tag team wrestler, do you feel that there is money in tag team wrestling still, or do you feel that it's just filler?
I kind of see it both ways. I think that there's money in it, but it's hard to keep two guys healthy. And when one's hurt, there's the tag team's gone. You know what I mean? You can't come out and do a single that night, and both other guys stand on the outside. So it's a risk factor more than anything else. Is it as entertaining? Yes, of course it is. I mean, it's 4 guys with exceptional ability in the ring instead of 2 guys with exceptional ability. But the business risk side of it is personalities. I mean, even related personalities, brothers, cousins, sons and things like that. So I get both sides of it personally. I'm not hung on tag teams to the point where because I was in a tag team a lot, the way I looked at it is I was smarter than the average wrestler. I spent more time in tag teams, so I did I did half the work and still made the same amount of money.
Any regrets looking back?
No, none. I really don't have anything that I could say that I wish I'd have done different. I could say that if I was to say it was a regret, it was more on my own ability that I wished I'd have been better at certain things or maybe taller. I mean, 6 foot when I started, that was average height, but it was never tall. It was taller than the Mike Grahams and some of Kevin Sullivans and some of those guys, but it wasn't the Barry Windham height. It wasn't the guy who stuck out. I mean, if anything, I said physically, I wish I would have had different genetics. If I was to say, I wish there was something different about what happened. Maybe, being Blackjack Mulligan size or being Andre size or something like that.
If you had to put one match on videotape for your child or grandchild to watch, what match would that be? What was your favorite?
I think it would be the match I had with Fujinami and Sapporo when I dropped the title to him because it was a really big build-up. I mean, I did 1 hour Broadways with Jack Briscoe, Dory Funk, Terry Funk, Ric Flair, Harley Race, and those were all phenomenal matches. But the focus was more on them as a world champion and me as a challenger. the match with me and Fujinami, I was a champion and I took the belt to a foreign country and was still able to entertain an audience and make it a very exciting match and a memorable one, not only to them, but the people that watched it. And it gets me recognition to this day when I go there.
Was it hard to adjust to the New Japan Japanese style?
Yes, it is. It's very hard to adjust to Japanese style. I mean, the first thing is you notice is the audience doesn't respond the same way. It's a quieter audience. I mean, they don't get as excited. And then the Japanese communication, speaking English and Japanese. I mean, I was limited Japanese. I knew 2 or 3 words. The first word I learned was itai, and that means it hurts. So I want to make sure I know that word because it let them know. But at the same time, I mean, it's accomplishable because it's an art form. It's a sincere athletic art form that can be accomplished even with language barriers.
Greatest rib you've ever seen?
The one I pulled. I'm the king. I had Curt Hennig arrested for statutory rape in Memphis airport getting off of an airplane. I'm really noted for hanging around the cops in the back of the arenas and talking to them because I admire law enforcement and stuff and what they do. And so I make friends with law enforcement, but they're practical jokers. And my best ribs have been with law enforcement. I had Mike Graham arrested in a hotel in Daytona Beach by a police officer, and he had me handcuffed in the hallway. But Curt Hennig arrested in Memphis airport. I swore out the warrant. It was an underage girl, and the dad had heard her talking on the phone. And that's what was on the warrant, that the dad overheard a conversation where she had had sex with the wrestler. And so the dad swore out the warrant. When Curt got off the airplane, I was standing there at the gate because you could do that back then. I was just hiding. And the law enforcement guy was perfect. He was about maybe 6'5", about 400 pounds, fat, redneck. It's about as redneck as you could get. The state of Tennessee there. And when Curt got off the plane, he said, "You Curt Hennig?" And Curt stuck out his hand thinking he was a fan, wanted to shake hands. He goes, "I don't want to shake your hand. You're under arrest." And he served him with the warrant. And I remember Kurt's face reading it as he was saying, "Yeah, this is me. Yeah. Statutory rape. I never even been to Memphis." He said, "I swear I never been to Memphis." And I remember the cop saying, "Well, there's 2 ways to leave the airport. You can either follow me out like a man, and I'll handcuff you and put you in a car, or I'll handcuff your ass right here and drag you through the airport." And Curt goes, "Well, I'm going with you." He said, "But I've never been to Memphis." And he goes, "I've never arrested one person that was innocent."
That is awesome.
So Curt got in the car, got in the back seat. The law enforcement guy handcuffed him. And I remember following Curt down the road. And Kurt's got both hands like he's doing a promo to the back of the cage, telling the cop, "I got a wife and 3 kids. I got a wife and 4 kids." The law guy, sheriff told me later everything Curt said. He was holding back the laughter. And then we didn't have cell phones back then, and there was no communication except for pay phones. And the police officer said, "Well, maybe if I pull into this 7-Eleven, you could call the dad on the phone and discuss this with him and tell him it must be a mistaken identity or something, you've never been here." And so they pulled over, and I pulled over right beside him. And when the deputy got out to let Curt out, I hit the down button on the window, and when Curt got out, I go, "Hey, where you going?" And he looked down, and he saw me, and he goes, "Oh, man." He didn't even ask me why I'm at that 7-Eleven. He didn't put nothing together. He was so upset about being arrested. He's handcuffed, and he's going, "Oh, man, I'm in trouble, man. I'm getting arrested for statutory rape." So I was one of the fabulous ones then, and I was a little full of myself. When I got out, I go, "I told you shouldn't mess with underage girls." And Kurt's going, "Don't even be funny. Don't be funny right now. This is not a funny thing." And the cop's holding back the thing, and the guy, he goes, he's got his money to go get the payphone. He says, "I'm going to call the guy." I said, "Well, let me see that warrant." So I took the warrant out of his hand, and I started reading it, right? And I'm watching Curt, and he's really nervous. And I said, yeah. "Oh, here's the part I signed where it says the judge. I signed his name right there." Now Curt looks at me, then he looks at the officer, right? And the guy starts to smile. Then he looks back at me, and I'm got a big smile on my face, and he realizes that he'd been ripped. And we started a chase scene around the 7-Eleven, and he's chasing me with handcuffs on. We went about 2 or 3 times around, and then he stopped, and he started laughing, and he goes, "You got me." He said, "That's tremendous."
That's
but
great.
He was gunning for me for the rest of his life. never really got me. A couple of times he told me he was going to push me in a pool at Wade Boggs' party. He was going to do this, but he said he never measured up to being arrested. And I was afraid if I took it to another level that you were going to go to another level too. So,
is there anything you want to say to your fans out there in closing?
If I was to say anything, it was that no matter what anybody ever hears, coming straight from me, I've had the greatest life in my business that I could have ever chosen. And if I had to go back and do it again, I'd go back and do it the exact same way. I'd go through the hardships. I'd go through the injuries, because the thrill you get as being a wrestler is uncomparable to anything. When you stand in the middle of the ring and the people are in a circumference audience that goes totally around you and they're screaming at you at the highest pitch, there's nothing else like that I could compare it to, and it's the biggest rush that I ever had in my life. I'm just happy that I'm still alive and I'm one of the old guys now.
Well, I want to thank you for being here today. The interview was great, and we wish you the best of luck in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you.
TitleMatchNetwork.com